It was morning, and the bright sunlight was streaming through the unshaded windows. The alarm clock started ringing loudly, and the young man on the bed rubbed his eyes sleepily, trying to wake up. He opened his eyes with difficulty. Suddenly there was genuine horror, incomprehension and surprise on his face, and sweat began to roll down his forehead. In his eyes, it was as if he could see the reflection of hieroglyphics burning with a blood-red light. He didn't even have time to swear. The guy jumped up and sat up in bed, and the walls and ceiling of his room were scrawled with something red. Individual words barely recognizable, all mixed together in some mess of sticks and liquid drips. The guy was terribly frightened and excited. He asked out of nowhere what it was, who had left all these hieroglyphics. But suddenly the inscriptions began to disappear, and disappeared as if they'd never been here. Wait, disappeared. Am I delusional? He thought and rubbed his eyes with his fist, trying to wake up. A fantasy or maybe a dream. But those hieroglyphics were really real. He continued to reason fearfully. Suddenly, the boy turned his head to the side. He started to put his feet on the floor and they were already in slippers. Apparently he slept in them. The guy sat up on the bed and suddenly realized in a daze that this wasn't really his room. Something was wrong here. As if something dark and ominous, some kind of aura surrounded the entire apartment as he walked around it, trying to figure out where he was. He remembered that there was an empty packet of instant noodles on the table, which he hadn't finished. And lying on the floor were 2 crumpled napkins that he had swiped past the trash can yesterday. What's even going on? He began to panic, grabbing his head. He tried to remember himself, but seemingly similar but different memories presented themselves in his mind. In one memory he was an infant in an ordinary cardboard box, left here hoping that there would be caring people for the child. And in the other he was already in a neat wicker basket. In one version he was unhappy and serious, with band-aids and bruises on his face. And in the other version he was a happy and well-cared-for teenager. And in the end, on one side he was a guy with a salesman's name tag, and on the other a guy in a university Confederate getting into a good school. His head was bursting with dual memories. He is still the same orphan. The age and face are similar, but the life path is totally different. Got care, passed his exams, got into the best university, one solid prospect. But now he had dropped out of high school and was working as an ordinary salesman. It seems he was in the body of Fan Zhu, himself from a parallel universe, although he had crossed over to another time. But then what did those inscriptions mean? The guy looked at the lone yellow lamp on the ceiling and thought about this whole situation, feeling nervous. There was nothing in the memory of the other him about this strange event. "Bunny, it's time to eat," a female voice called out to him from the next room. Fan Zhu immediately broke out in a cold sweat and he barely had time to be surprised. Suddenly smiling, a gorgeous woman walked into the room, a beauty with very long white hair, bright violet eyes, barely wearing a nightie with a beautiful figure. "Bunny," wondered the guy. Fan Zhu looked at the girl and thought that has he already gotten married in a parallel universe. The girl quickly went to the bed and sat on it, saying that since he was awake, it was time to go eat. Nice switch, Fan Zhu thought. Of course he couldn't help but be happy to have such company, although he was still a little embarrassed. In the past, he would never have found such a beautiful and affectionate friend. The girl continued to glare at him and smiled gently, repeating what she had said earlier. Fan Zhu immediately fearfully wondered, what should he call her? Wife, girlfriend, or maybe sweetheart? Or his little girl? He thought and was immediately embarrassed by his thoughts. A nickname for her is appropriate though. Maybe this version of him has something about this girl in his memory. Fan Zhu immediately racked his brain and tried to focus on finding information about his apparently wife. But then a realization pierced him to the heart. No name, no biography, no hobbies, favorite pose absent, nothing. He has no such person in his memory. The girl, however, also changed in her face. She was still smiling, but her eyes were too empty. The girl turned to him with a face that was terrifyingly fake. She was no longer cute in an instant. Her eyes were as if hypnotic, trying to draw Fan Zhu into her net. "Who are you?" the boy whispered stammeringly. This caught her attention. Her face immediately turned monstrous. Her eyes turned black, and the cracked skin fell away from her cheeks, exposing flesh and beastly fangs. "Can you see me?" she growled. Fan Zhu was too shocked to reply and mumbled something like his brain was too overloaded right now and he was about to once again. He didn't have time to finish. The monster immediately became huge. Claws grew out of its arms, its hair twisted in the air like snakes, and its mouth was like a spider's, huge and like tearing apart a fake human face, its tongue hanging out almost to the monster's chest. "You can see me," it roared and attacked Fan Zhu. From fear, the guy froze and cried, unable to move. The monster didn't wait for any reaction and bit off Fan Zhu's head, closing its huge mouth on his neck. With a scream, the guy woke up and jumped up on the bed. Sweat dripped down his face, which was full of fear and panic. What was that? I'm not dead, it was a dream, right? He tried to convince himself, but the red hieroglyphics on the ceiling reappeared, cycling back and forth. I'm dead, he thought. Just like last time, the inscriptions quickly dissolved, as if they had never existed. This isn't a dream. Could it be a clue? Pretend to be blind, suggested Fan Zhu, looking at his terribly shaking hands. He immediately rejected the idea and grabbed his head, flipping through the memories in his head. No, the other version of him definitely sees everything. He's a normal human after all. Judging by his memories, his other version had never seen his so-called wife at all. Always lived alone, never heard of such a thing. That phrase she said made some sense. Not to let her know that he could see her. Then she won't exist, Fan Zhu concluded, sitting on the bed and thinking about everything. Just like the scenario, a girl or monster immediately entered the room. Bunny, already awake, let's go eat, she said just like last time. But he did not look up at her. Fan Zhu nervously tried not to look at her in any way, and she was clearly trying to attract his attention with her appearance. Perhaps that in physical existence is the way to a normal life, he thought. The guy didn't look at her for a while. But the monster wasted no time and knelt down in front of the bed the guy was sitting on. This monster's body had very prominent breasts, which it displayed, enticing Fan Zhu to pay attention. Don't move, don't look or you'll die, the guy repeated in his head, all sweaty from exertion. But suddenly, the girl's head snapped out almost 180 degrees and looked at Fan Zhu with her neck twisted. My move, she whispered. In the guy's eyes, one could see the real essence of this monstrous creature. Fan Zhu was almost on the verge of passing out from the tension, but the monster smiled. You don't play by the rules, do you? She grinned. With a giggle, it stuck out its huge long tongue. The tongue swiped across Fan Zhu's cheek, leaving something like a poisonous or bloody trail. It was hard to tell what other abilities the monster possessed. You can see me, she laughed. Its tongue crept further and further across the shocked boy's face. With a crunch, Fan Zhu's head was once again bitten off as if it was nothing. Once again, he opened his eyes, lying in bed, sweaty, frightened, remembering everything about what had happened seemingly moments ago. He moved on the bed and swore he was getting sick of this hopeless situation, even though he hadn't tried every option to get out of it yet. His hands were shaking. How did I get to this point? He cursed, clutching his head. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to think. Is he in a time loop? After he dies, he starts over from the beginning. Like in a game. He looked towards the door from where that hated overly cunning monster was about to appear. He was just looking down, not looking at her. But she herself walked over to make sure. Fan Zhu reached for the phone, so she must first make sure he could see her. On his phone, he opened some kind of online broadcast that was hosted by a beautiful girl in a swimsuit or something similar. He tucked himself very close to the phone. Meanwhile, the monster crept up behind him. Bunny, it's time to eat, she said as usual. She suddenly looked at the screen of the phone and although not very annoyed, but with acclaim asked why he was looking at other girls. You only love me, she said and sat down next to him. I love you, he thought irritably, not taking his eyes off the phone. The girl immediately leaned close to him and started teasing him mockingly, realizing that he was avoiding her gaze. I didn't realize you were nearsighted, she smirked. Why are you looking so close at your phone? You can see me, or can't you after all? She whispered. A cold sweat ran down Fan Zhu's back and tensed up. Why isn't this brazen technique forbidden? He thought, poking at the phone screen. He glanced sideways for a second, checking where she was looking and thought that it was still fine for now. Suddenly a broadcast notification came up on his phone and he clicked there. His eyes immediately almost flew out of his orbits. The girl was on the phone screen, wearing the same nightie and lying on the bed, propping her head up with her hand. Bunny, can you see well? She said from the phone's speakers. Fan Zhu jumped up and threw the phone away with a shriek of horror. He stood in a daze and looked at the bed where he was sitting before. The monster caught up with him and appeared behind him, saying that he could see her. You can see me, the creature roared, opening its mouth and ready to attack again. Fan Zhu reflexively turned around and swung his fist with a curse, let it be. He tried to strike, but the monster dodged, though it was confused. Its maw opened even wider and a second row of teeth could be seen deep in its mouth. It clawed into his arm, tearing the flesh with its fangs. Fan Zhu screamed in pain and tears spurted from his eyes. Blood splattered across the room. The monster chewed off the guy's arm and licked his trophy with its long tongue contentedly, intending to attack again. The guy in a frenzy of pain hardly felt anything anymore, only fell back against the wall. Eaten this time, he thought. His eyes were already blurring and closing. He was about to die. Next time will be different. The voice of that monster was calling to him for the umpteenth time. Her phrasing never changed. Breakfast, eat rather, bunny. For the 6th time, her head came right out of the toilet as Fan Zhu tried to hide from her. He cussed out in fear. His face was covered in sweat, realizing what was about to happen to him when their gazes collided again. Died due to low skill. For the 8th time now, he tried to escape, to break out the door, but there was a grate. He screamed, twitching, trying to get through the bars, but the monster caught up with him once again. His nerves were already on edge. It seemed to be an endless circle, Groundhog Day. There was no escaping it. He would decide to play along once, and when she called for him to eat again, he agreed and looked at her knowingly. It's better to enjoy it all. It's exactly like this, you see me? Enjoy your appetite, Fan Zhu said before the monster tore him to pieces. After 13 attempts, he was already begging for death. His body was shaking and he was at the limit of stress, because no matter how hard he tried, he died every time. Healthy on the outside, but sick at heart. Alive on the outside, but dead on the inside. Death is unstoppable. 14, 15, 16 times. At each death, memories of a different version of him resurface and he begins to understand the world better and better. The endless cycle of waking up, trying to escape an imminent death was like an endless fall for the guy. He was plunging into a lake of blood with pain on his face. The only difference from the past is that the essence of this world is beyond his comprehension. 18 attempt. He once again lay on the bed with his eyes closed. Fan Zhu was asking himself a whole bunch of questions. Why can't he stop this loop? Who wrote those characters on the wall? Why do they disappear as soon as he starts looking at them? The guy opened his eyes for the umpteenth time. What are these things? Are they responsible for all the urban legends? Looks like my wife is one of them, he thought as he got up on the bed again. He knew what awaited him, though he was a little seemingly even determined. Here she is, the rascal. Die, die, die. You must die. To save yourself you must die. It was like a mantra in his head. Bunny, the girl called out to him again. She was calling him to eat again, but he decided to trick her this time. The monster woke him up every time, but she never once touched him. The guy walked confidently over to her. They looked straight into each other's eyes and she asked him what he wanted to eat first. Bunny, you can see me, she said as usual. But Fan Zhu was calm as he came so close to her. Absolutely, he thought, and walked right through her as if she was a ghost. So the guy walked right past her without fear or hesitation. She can only strike when she's sure I'm him seeing her. He was in the kitchen making himself pancakes when she came running in and said she had already made him breakfast and needed to eat what she made. He didn't pay any attention to her. Beautiful, so also more cunning than I might initially think, thought the guy. I'm having breakfast, he answered her. Actually, of course not. Fan Zhu made himself breakfast, a sandwich with vegetables, cheese and other goodies that looked nicer than something made by monster hands, even if the food didn't look bad. The only way to get out of there was to go outside and through the understanding of this so-called wife find out what was wrong with this world. The guy didn't even get a bite of his breakfast before the girl's face appeared right on the floor. She was clearly skilled at trying to get him to look at her. She asked why he wasn't eating the breakfast she had prepared. Don't you like the way I cook? She asked slyly. The guy had already gone to the front door and she still hadn't caught him, though she hadn't stopped trying. All that was left was to get out. Suddenly her eyes appeared in the reflection of the metal doorknob and she begged him to stay. Bunny doesn't need to go anywhere. He needs to spend time with her at home. Fan Zhu walked out of the apartment. Now he had a chance to get his revenge. The door closed behind him. He was finally in the driveway. No one would get away with 18 murders. No one. He was determined to get revenge on this strange monster. The boy walked down the stairs to the first floor. He would find a way to destroy everything. And then he would come back again to kill this thing. Finally, in front of his eyes was the door leading to the street. Fan Zhu turned the handle and the door opened easily. The red light flooded his face and blinded his eyes. But the guy seemed to have quickly guessed where he was. There was panic in his gaze again. This is hell, isn't it? Indeed, the sky was glowing red. All the buildings looked like ordinary buildings from the real world, but destroyed, and there were strange slug-like monsters crawling around, and a blue head flying in the sky, huge and seemingly belonging to someone male. The world that appeared before Fan Zhu's eyes was hard to describe. It was as if a whole host of folklore monsters from different mythologies were in this place. An eye with bird wings that watched everyone like the sun, huge cyclopes, many faceless dark shadows, a monstrous hare standing on two legs in traditional Chinese clothing that looked different from the rest and as if it was the most normal, and a praying woman who was missing half of her head. Looking at all of this, the guy burst out laughing hysterically. cold sweat ran down his face. How interesting this world is, he shouted, either in a panic attack or just in shock. Suddenly nausea came up to his throat. The guy leaned on a lamppost and vomited violently. His face was stunned, pale, and fatigue was reflected on it. But suddenly a child's voice was heard. "Uncle, are you all right?" the child asked. In shock, he stared at the child. It was a little girl with ponytails and a lollipop in her mouth. She asked if he was sick. Though his face was haggard, he said he was fine and she could take it easy. He rubbed her head and thought that it would be nice to have such a cute little companion. But this was a big mistake. "You can see me," growled the monster the girl had turned into. It was now a creature with a face like an animal skull, burning pupils in its eye sockets, and teeth like it was a saber-toothed tiger. Fan Zhu was in another state of shock and confusion. He raised his head upwards as the monster grew to an unprecedented size in a second. "You can see me," the monster kept repeating. It was now a huge semblance of a man, but its belly was a bit holey, there was no flesh on it, only its spine holding it up. And in the hand of this giant was a sword or something similar, with which he swung at the hero. The man stood silent at first and didn't move. Then he laughed hysterically again. "This is all very interesting," he shouted. He said that at first he liked the girl very much and he didn't even think that she would want to kill him. However, the monster hardly heard or understood him, still preparing to strike. But Fan Zhu continued and said that there are so many monsters like this and in general, he didn't need to worry about the lack of chances to die. "This is so cool. You're all already dead," he shouted. The monster just crushed him with one blow of its weapon. The boy opened his eyes again. He was lying on the bed in the room. Again, his wife the monster was waking him up again, sitting next to him on the bed. In 20 days, there had already been so many different breakfasts. Fan Zhu sat outside in the park. It looked like a normal human park, with benches, a fountain, green trees. In fact, it was all like two worlds had merged into one, and it was as if Fan Zhu could see between those worlds. Again that lollipop girl, who was actually a creepy monster with a sword, came up to him and asked him to take her home since she couldn't find her mom. He ignored her, just sat on a bench and watched all the monsters. After watching for half a day, he realized that this world is crawling with all sorts of creatures. Some are scary and stupid. Others, though aggressive, are like air and can't interact with anything. A couple of monsters caught his attention. A girl, no different from a normal person, wearing a summer hat and a rather open robe, was taking selfies, and behind her was a monster that looked like a huge monkey with horns, but it was translucent, like a ghost. The third ones had the exact same shape as a human. Then he paid attention to a seemingly ordinary boy in a cap and t-shirt, who was skateboarding, and behind him sat a girl looking like a classic Japanese spirit with long hair and a yukata, completely white, but not ghostly, and pestered the boy to play with her. All of these monsters get as close to the target as possible, as if they were kin to them, and then getting a backlash they strike, like his monster wife, for example. But even though the common man can't detect them at all, they still haunt him in their role. What do they even need all this for? He pondered, sitting on the bench, collating all the information he had and remembering his so-called wife, trying to analyze her behavior. Suddenly a thought struck him. Maybe they want to be one with the humans. The balance on WeChat is 3 yuan. The boy's phone alerted him as he picked it up. Yeah, with a balance like that, I'll have to get a job to explore this world, he thought. Fan Zhu was riding his bike down the street, but stopped to rummage through his phone. Suddenly, he received a text message from the manager of Yuda High, Alcoholic Fan Zhu. "The sun is already at its zenith and you're not at work yet. How many tardies do you already have this month? How many locations have you visited? You want a bonus or not? A bonus? Good," he thought. His assignment was to check on a house that was sold 6 months ago, and the owner never paid. He got a few more messages. It was hot outside, but he didn't have much water in a bottle with him. It should have been enough for a while though. He replied to the message and wrote that he had already quit, but would meet him later at the sales office to settle his last case. The sun was already setting and the sky was orange, beautifully illuminating the street with gold. Fan Zhu rushed on his bike to his place of business to meet the manager. Eventually he arrived and slowed down. Suddenly, he saw a signboard of either a hospital or a pharmacy burning neon green. He stopped his bike with his foot and looked up at the building. "Where is that sales office?" he asked himself, looking around a little nervously. He got off his bike and reached the column of the building, the sign on which read, Kinshan Psychiatric Hospital. Suddenly, a phone call rang. It was actually the manager he had come to see. He asked him if something was wrong and why the guy stopped answering. He said that everything was fine and asked if the manager was at the site now. The manager replied that he was, and a little fool like him wouldn't answer the phone, yelling at him and making him overwork. "That's right, I'm off-site. I'll call you back soon," the guy answered and hung up. He looked back and forth at the screen of his phone, then at the hospital. It was once the Bailu Academy, but now it was a mental hospital. It didn't make any sense though. It couldn't be that creepy but also interesting at the same time. He walked into the building, tucking his phone into the back pocket of his pants. Suddenly he was startled because he bumped into something soft. He let out a curse. "I mean something soft." He looked down in surprise. The guy reached out his hand and thought that this must be why he couldn't come in here. But instead of something disgusting that he expected to find, he found some woman's breasts, which he grabbed with his hands. Fanzu was immediately creepily embarrassed. He barely had time to be surprised. He received a very good slap from the owner of the breasts he had so unceremoniously grabbed. The girl immediately jumped up and began to insult him, saying that she would sue him, and the guy awkwardly and fearfully pressed a cool palm to his cheek, burning from the blow. Suddenly a policeman appeared out of nowhere and immediately started asking what was wrong. Why was there such a commotion? And the girl ran up to him. The guy raised his head and was even more surprised. He stood up and in front of his eyes was now far from an abandoned mental hospital, but Bailu Academy. Fanzu was riddled with confusion. He suddenly squeezed his eyes tightly shut. And when he opened his eyes, everything around him was already red, and in place of the academy was a hospital. The guy dumbfoundedly thought that the academy had disappeared again. He stood next to the building and didn't dare to approach again. His hands were shaking. He tried to touch a column, but his hand went through as if through a ghost, even though the building looked more than real. In his perception, two buildings from two different realities combined and became a mess. He could see it, but he couldn't feel it. Scared of what might happen if other people can see this, he thought, hesitantly looking behind the building. Fanzu thrust his hand through the wall again. Suddenly, the red light shone too brightly and he had to cover his face with his hands. But then he opened his eyes and was horrified at what had happened. He could see a ghostly projection of the building he had entered, with some objects standing out more than others, glowing slightly with golden light. It was all one big mystery covered in darkness. He reached the sign for ward or room 104. The assembly hall, the restroom, the canteen, not a soul anywhere. Yet there is a heavy odor of blood in this room. The door was an ominous blood-red color. The entire building was dilapidated. There was clearly no one or nothing in it for a long time. Just a bunch of empty boxes, crates, and fire extinguishers. Fanzu was focused to find out what was going on here. He reached out for the door and it was as transparent as everything in this other world. He walked through the door into the ward and heard crying or whimpering, loud enough to attract attention. There was someone lying on one of the beds, shaking with crying. The boy moved a little closer, carefully examining whoever was lying on the bed. It was a ghostly girl in a nightie, sitting with her back to him and her hair covering her face. She kept whimpering and whining. "Brother," she said suddenly. "Brother." She turned around and her face was dead, bluish, her eye sockets were empty. Her mouth was open, but it felt as if there was some sinister aura on her face and body. The guy only turned around in response and walked back through the wall. The ghost girl remained silent, for she was not paid attention to. Infiltrated, he thought, walking through the walls and encountering various monsters and ghosts. There was a horrible creature on the other side of the wall too. A mostly shapeless red something, but with a human face, mouth, nose, and 4 burning green eyes. Fanzu took a step back, turned around and walked away. The monster was, let's say, slightly perplexed. There are at least a dozen monsters here, he thought as he walked from one chamber to another. Room 162 had a whole bunch of ghosts in purple robes. And in room 169 was a small monster that looked like a plucked chicken, more cute than creepy. Some doors to the chambers are wide open and monsters can walk out of them. He walked past room 177 and through the ruined walls a skeleton monster that looked like a human with its skin still peeling off was staring at him. And next to it was something with tentacles. Fanzu simply walked past them all. Just like the previous times, the monsters were all making those faces, but he was the only one who could remain calm. It was only because his beloved wife had killed him 18 times. He walked through another wall. He found something on the floor, a pile of papers scattered all over the place. Apparently they were hospital records and charts. Maybe he could get something out of them. But they were all blank, or there might have been something on them before, but not anymore. The guy was stunned. Had all this really been created by humans? Were these creepy wards used to be full of human patients? He crouched down to try to pick up the sheets, but couldn't. It couldn't be. It's all ephemeral and he can't pick up these hospital charts. Some kind of hair or rope suddenly fell on him from the ceiling, but since they belonged to a monster, they went through his body. He was scared of course and tried to get up. There was indeed a monster on the ceiling above, a woman with twisted limbs and a head that seemed to be stuck to the ceiling and her long black hair hanging down over his head. She was wearing a hospital mask and a gown of either a nurse or a doctor. The woman leaned closer to him, whispering in his ear. She asked him that since he was here, wouldn't he want to join her to explore the mysteries of existence. Her mouth was very close to his ear, but he paid no attention. He completely ignored her, much to his puzzlement, and continued to just ponder. He decided that if there was a clue in this observation room, there must be more in other places. But the exact answer had to be in the center of it all, the warden's office. Then I can take it by storm, he thought. Fan Zhu came to a rich-looking large hall, with an open top of the second and even the third floor, with a reception desk, a luxurious crystal chandelier on top, and everything was finished in dark wood. Surprisingly, the hospital office is intertwined with the sales office. There is no dean's office on the first floor, maybe it is above then. The guy walked further down the corridor and suddenly heard two people talking. Why hasn't Fan Zhu come yet? The first one asked. Yu Dahai was already furious, although he certainly better not cross him. It was actually Yu Dahai himself, a bald old man wearing gold jewelry and an ugly pink shirt with blue dots. And the second person was Zhao Hao, a young awkward guy with glasses and bangs. The supervisor shouted at Fan Zhu, how dare he even dare to come here again? I already fired you, don't you know that yet? He shouted. Fan Zhu himself just ran past them, pushing them away with his hands. There was no office on the second floor either. The guy with glasses couldn't say anything, but he looked at him with a bit of fear. The old man on the other hand started yelling again. You pushed me away. How dare you? Who let you go up to the third floor? Stop, you're already fired. You can't go up there, shouted Yu Dahai. Fan Zhu ran up the stairs and the old man told the guy with glasses that he would go and stop him now. The guy was taken aback. Fan Zhu, meanwhile, was already walking down the corridors littered with junk-like boxes. Found it. One of the doors had the signboard he needed hanging on it. Just as he was about to open the door, two of his former co-workers ran after him and told him not to open the door. Fan Zhu of course didn't listen and turned the handle. It's over, whined Yu Dahai. Zhao Hao awkwardly recognized one person who was in the office at that moment. Fei Fei, he said, sweating awkwardly. Fan Zhu froze as well. A groan was heard and a woman's legs wearing only capron pantyhose appeared in the doorway. Then, one could see someone's hands grabbing the woman's thighs. And finally they all saw a very beautiful and almost undressed office worker, Lai Fei Fei, and her partner, another worker Wan Jai Teng. They had clearly been interrupted for indecency after work and were awkwardly trying to cover themselves. The man pulling up his pants reprimanded and asked who let Fan Zhu in here in the first place. The man resolutely walked towards them and grabbed the girl's arm. The girl shrieked and asked him to let her go. Wan Jai Teng swore and told everyone to get out, and also let his employee go. Why are you yelling? You fools! Fan Zhu scolded and threw the girl off the table and onto the floor where she was sitting. Of course they caught her and tried to calm her down, but she managed to resent him for daring to push her. The guy meanwhile was rummaging through the desk trying to find some semblance of clues. He found an old, tattered piece of paper, and was very surprised when he read it. This hospital really did hold great secrets. Fan Zhu smiled victoriously at his find. He had clearly found what he was looking for. Around him, the dark aura of the netherworld began to thicken again. On the paper was written, "He who is favored by fortune. Do you long to know the truth of the world? Are you filled with lust for the source of all troubles? You've come to this place, you've had your fill of doubts. But do not hurry, my friend. The key to knowledge oozes from room 520 in C block. There you will find what you praise. Go. But when you find it, the choice is yours. Follow your gut and accept the gift of fate." Zhu Qingfeng must be the director of this hospital, thought the boy. But to whom is this letter addressed? He stepped away from the office desk, and the sky outside was already dark scarlet turning to purple. How could this author know that he was coming? Fan Zhu walked down the corridor, and Zhao Hao ran after him and asked if he was all right. Block C, room 520. Maybe the answer to all the questions would be there. Suddenly, the light bulb above his head flickered and burned out, cracking. Someone suddenly shrieked. Zhao Hao asked, did the fuses blow? Wan Jai Teng told Yu Dahai to ask where the electrical panel was, who replied that he was already dialing the number. The girl said she was scared in this darkness, in this place and at this hour. I don't think it's just a blackout, Fan Zhu suggested. No, he whispered and turned on the flashlight on his phone. No what? You're scaring me today, replied Zhao Hao. The guy held the phone in front of him, illuminating everything around him as far as the phone's flashlight allowed, and walked towards the exit to the balcony that connected the lobby and the third floor. What are you doing? Zhao Hao called out to him. King Shan Psychiatric Hospital. You can't see anything at all. Fan Zhu stood by the stairs and shone his phone at the hall. Everyone else was also going down the stairs. Fei Fei was whining about being scared and generally acting like a little kid. Wen Jiateng asked if Yu Dahai had even gotten through to anywhere, but he said he hadn't. He had texted but it hadn't been delivered. The boss said that according to his capabilities and position, he has access to more than they can all imagine about the hidden secrets of the world. There is no cell phone signal and no electricity voltage, and unless he is mistaken, these signs prove one thing. We have entered the forbidden zone, the man said. Fan Zhu smiled, lighting up everything with his phone as if he had achieved what he wanted. Meanwhile, panic broke out in the offices as the electricity was cut off throughout the building. One of the office staff whined and screamed that his spreadsheet wasn't saved and this stupid and inappropriate blackout would now cost him tons of overtime hours to restore it all. Yu Dahai told them not to yell, but rather to look for the switchboard. People were yelling, going back and forth and trying to find anything at all, emergency lights or a switchboard. A security guard approached one of the employees and asked if everything was okay. Fine, but just whining now about the amount of future overtime, the employee replied. The guard said he was going to go check the plugs and he thanked him. The girls in the office were trying to turn on their computers and do something. One of them fumbled for her cell phone in the dark. She turned on the flashlight, but it was so dim and hardly illuminated anything. Everyone immediately tried to turn on a flashlight as well, but they were all just as weak. Some of them tried to wipe the lens, some of them cussed and banged on the phone as if that would suddenly make it work better. But all of them started to confirm that the flashlights were barely or not working at all. And on Fan Zhu's phone, it suddenly went out as well. He looked at his now useless phone and asked Wen Jiateng what this area was after all. The employees overheard the two of them talking about some kind of forbidden zone and started to murmur. The girl said it's all lies and most likely just something happened. Maybe we're not going to die, replied someone in the crowd. And the guy interrupted him and said that how is it even possible, they shouldn't panic. Wen Jiateng didn't have to put up with this ruckus for long and quickly shouted at them all to shut up. He shouted to everyone that what he was about to say was a matter of life and death, and they were all very much advised to listen to him. The panicked employees stopped talking and stared at their boss. The man sighed before he began to speak. He told them that in this world, everything supernatural and otherworldly has a place. So-called the Forbidden Zone is the realm of supernatural forces, which can be understood as subspace. This is the spooky world, he told them all, though fear was already showing on his face. The trembling plateau. Everyone was silent for a second and in this situation just took all this information for granted. There was nowhere to go anyway. Suddenly one guy, who was arguing with a girl before, asked if the guard was back. It had been 3 minutes since he'd left to check the fuses in the panel. Had he run into everyone suddenly fell silent again. In a panic, the supervisor said that an ordinary person needed incredible confidence to bypass the laws of this world. Otherwise death awaited him. A panicked Yu Dahai shook him by the shoulder and asked what they should all do now. We need to figure out how to get out of here alive, he replied. Otherwise they'll all die here. Nervousness swept through the crowd in a wave. No one even thought of arguing. Fan Zhu felt something with his unusual sensitivity to all things otherworldly. It was as if he could sense something behind his back. A familiar feeling, is it really? He thought and turned around. A cold sweat ran down his face. They're here. They are already here, Fan Zhu alerted everyone. What are you talking about? Where are they? One staff member asked and the other one asked as well. And somewhere in the back, a monster had already started attacking one of the female employees, trying to entangle her with something that looked like tentacles. The next second her mouth was clamped shut, her hands were tied and she couldn't move. The monster caught her. The man said, this guy is definitely lying. But Fan Zhu noticed something. Wang Xiao Lai. She had disappeared. And it was at that moment that her friend noticed that the girl was now not where she used to stand, as if she was never there. Her friend turned around and said that it was impossible, she was there just now. The girl immediately started running and calling her everywhere, hoping that Wang Xiao Lai would now come out from around the corner and everything would be fine. But she didn't answer and she was nowhere to be found. The panicked employees looked around, finding it hard to believe that she had just disappeared in the middle of nowhere, as if she had vanished. Wen Jiateng turned to Fan Zhu and asked if he had seen anything, monsters for example. Of course he lied in response and said that he hadn't seen anything, only that Wang Xiao Lai had disappeared. The staff started pointing fingers at him and accusing him of being so calm when a person would be dragged away by a monster in the middle of nowhere. Someone even said that Fan Zhu was definitely possessed by these creatures. Wen Jiateng pointed out that the guy didn't seem to be afraid of them at all. "Are you an Esper?" he asked. "Esper?" the guy asked again. The man immediately frowned skeptically. Fan Zhu didn't even blink an eye when all these entities appeared, and he doesn't know anything about Espers. Who is he? He finally decided to explain and said that an Esper is a person with paranormal abilities. His cousin was one of those. Wen Jiateng said that the best way to defeat the monsters was to use Fan Zhu's Esper abilities to the max. So the Espers here are practicing their abilities here. The guy clarified with a smirk. "Isn't that right?" The man shivered. Even now, Fan Zhu could think so clearly, so he will be the key for them to escape from here. Wen Jiateng said that his brother once told him that to become an Esper one must use powers. There are 2 conditions for that: to experience baptism by the fear of death, causing the soul to suffer, and to allow supernatural forces to enter you. Suddenly, it was as if something tried to break into Fan Zhu's heart. Metaphorically, of course, or maybe not. Wen Jiateng continued and said that we should remember that the power of an Esper is like a bloody rag, and when we wipe with it, use the power, we cannot avoid defiling our soul. In Fan Zhu's view, it was like a blood-stained divination ball that was wiped with a dirty cloth to better see what was inside. This fortune ball seemed to be reflected in the guy's eyes. He felt a change in himself. Something was wrong. An aura of incomprehensible energy filled his body. He looked at his hands, trying to understand the logic behind how interaction with the monster world worked. Because of the loop of rebirths, he had never really touched them. A wife, streets full of monsters, and they were all just an illusion he could never touch. But if they start to materialize and get a chance to break into reality, they'll be able to kill people right away. So if he touched them, he could also use the powers to destroy them. He smiled smugly, finally getting the strength for the revenge he had been waiting for since he woke up in this strange reality. Die, die, die. Only that thought was drumming in his head. He couldn't forget the monstrous creature with a pretty face full of hypocrisy and a lust to devour humans, keeping him trapped in his own home, killing him 18 times. I must take revenge. This was the only thing Fan Zhu could think about. He owed it to himself to become an Esper. Suddenly, there was a scream that distracted him from thinking about the essence of monsters. Gone. The workers screamed in panic. Jia Liang. He was just there, and then he vanished like all the other people. Wen Jiateng tisked and the panic around him made him tense up and think of not the most pleasant outcome. He immediately yelled for them all to shut up if they didn't want to attract these things here. Fei Fei continued to whimper and cry, asking the man what they should do now since she wants to disappear. "What are you asking me?" Wen Jiateng snapped at her. 2 or 3 minutes. This caught everyone's attention. People disappear every 2-3 minutes, Fan Zhu clarified. To be precise, women every 2 minutes, men every 3 minutes. After the guard disappeared, 3 minutes passed after Wang Xiaolai disappeared. And after her, 2 minutes later, Jia Liang vaporized in the same place. Fan Zhu looked at his phone, checking the time. If everything was correct, 3 minutes had already passed, which meant that someone else was about to disappear. Everyone froze in fear, and the guy just decided to go far away from here, further investigating this whole situation. Zhao Hao called out to him and asked him where he didn't go. Does he want to die? Of course I'm looking for a way out. And you're still standing there waiting to die? Fan Zhu snarled. But then he was stopped by another Wen Jiateng who ordered him to stop. But the guy didn't turn around, only paused for a moment to say that there were only 8 people left, and if the theory of the minutes that people disappear was to be believed, then in 20 minutes, everyone would be dead. "You're an ordinary person," objected Wen Jiateng. "How do you know that?" But he didn't finish his thought and froze in silence. He was attracted by something in Fan Zhu's appearance. His gaze was wild, as if looking through all these people. He didn't really care about what would really happen to them all. "One more word and I'll kill you myself," Fan Zhu said. Zhao Hao and Fan Zhu crawled along the dark corridors that were only lit by phones with flashlights in their hands. The guy with glasses was saying that you can't just crawl around here like this. Why hadn't they come to the entrance yet? "Hush," Fan Zhu besieged him. He looked deep into the corridor where a bright green, dazzling color was burning. "This light, it's the same as the one in that hospital," the guy remarked. "Really?" Suddenly, a scared and nervous Zhao Hao called out to him. Fan Zhu immediately recognized this place. He had been here before. "This is King Shan Psychiatric Hospital." The guy with glasses hid behind Fan Zhu's back and clearly had no intention of continuing the journey alone. He was like a scared little rabbit. He asked his companion if he was just glitching. "Where are we anyway?" The guy with the glasses persisted. "They should be in the office. Why are they in an asylum straight out of a cheap horror movie?" "Can you see the hospital too?" said Fan Zhu. Zhao Hao replied that of course he could see it in the whole long creepy corridor too. He suddenly decided to try and check it out, so he leaned against the wall of the hospital. His hand touched a very real tree, though before it had passed through as if through something ghostly. Indeed, the hospital's subspace and their reality had become one, and so had its inhabitants. No wonder they couldn't see the hospital before. And it turned out that the hospital had absorbed their office, and they were always essentially inside it. So that's what this forbidden area was, Fan Zhu finally realized with a satisfied smile on his face. Suddenly, as they walked forward, they saw red stains on the floor. It was already clear what it was. Zhao Hao at a loss could not believe his eyes that what he stepped in was blood. But recognition appeared in Fan Zhu's eyes. The guard's uniform and suit. It was Wang Xiaolai and their guard Zhao. In front of them were scraps of clothes, blood and flesh, what was left of these people after the monster's dinner. Suddenly, Fan Zhu turned on something like deduction and concluded that since all the female office workers had mostly regular facial features, slim figures, and a body mass index within the normal range, they were clearly better than the men, so the monster ate them slower, in 3 minutes instead of 2 minutes like the women. So much for the difference in the time it took to discover the missing people. Zhao Hao was shocked. You mean they were all eaten? He clarified in panic. Fan Zhu sat down on his knees in front of the remains of what appeared to be Wang Xiaolai. He tried to reassure his companion and said that since the monsters had recently taken one of the men again, they were relatively safe for now. The guy with glasses didn't like the thought of his colleague somewhere being devoured by a monster right now. Fan Zhu didn't really pay much attention to all the killing. Most of the monsters are locked in the wards, but suddenly a door is opened somewhere. It turns out that some of them might have escaped. But they had never encountered any monster here, even though they had wandered around for quite a while. He examined the remains of the bloody clothes on the floor and noticed the distinctive claw marks on the fabric. The clothes are clean enough and the blood is only at the site of the cuts, meaning they were worked with something sharp and quite quickly. It can only be someone he's already encountered. Medical personnel, for example. Suddenly, something tried to climb out from above right from the ceiling. Fan Zhu immediately understood everything. Medical personnel who could freely crawl around the hospital. That is, a nurse. Suddenly, this thing attacked him from the ceiling, trying to grab him with its hands. From the depths of the corridor, grinding and various other sounds that were not particularly pleasant in such a place could be heard. Fan Zhu and his bespectacled companion looked at where the sound was coming from in surprise and fear. But suddenly, the sound began to move and started to approach them. Zhao Hao froze in fear. So did Fan Zhu. The source of the sound was getting closer and closer. It was someone's footsteps, but it became clear when that someone was a couple of meters away from them, but hidden in the darkness. Suddenly, feet showed themselves. They were the wandering office workers who were trying to stay together. Wen Jiatang with a flashlight on his phone and Fei Fei clinging to his arm. Yu Dahai panically weaving a little behind, and a few other workers who were still alive. One of the men asked where they were in general and if they were still in their office or somewhere else. Looks like a hospital, someone answered him. Zhao Hao and Fan Zhu froze, not even knowing what to say since they had already gotten scared for nothing. Yu Dahai immediately recognized them and asked them how they were here, if they had found the missing people. Suddenly, everyone was pierced by the shrill scream of Fei Fei, who noticed blood on the ground. Blood, she shouted. Well, yes, there was indeed a blood stain with small scraps of clothing. Wen Jiatang immediately recognized those clothes and realized that apparently all the missing people had already been eaten. Fei Fei immediately clutched onto his arm and said that they should hurry up and get out of here. He had already agreed and wanted to run away, but he turned around to see the two guys looking puzzled. Fan Zhu, lead us, he said. But he only stood there with his phone in his hands. The timer on the phone, which he had started to count down the time between kills, counted down 3 minutes. It's time. Time has come for what? Fei Fei interjected. Behind her and Wen Jiatang, the monster's dangling hair appeared, ready to grab either of them. They slowly turned around and looked up until they saw the creature behind their backs. It was crawling along the ceiling above them, and though its mask hid a huge maw, its broken limbs and broken neck evoked nothing but horror. The monster's eyes suddenly moved apart. Fei Fei was stunned by the sight of this creature and stood there with her mouth open. Suddenly, the mask fell from the monster's mouth and it instantly swung at the girl, baring its fangs, ready to devour her and leave nothing behind. They all screamed and ran away. Both the employees and their boss tried to run away so that the monster wouldn't target them. Let's get out of here, shouted Wen Jiatang. But suddenly, something grabbed him from behind and stopped him. Fei Fei fell to the ground, stumbling as she ran, but managed to grab onto the edge of his jacket. He might have wanted to help her, but the monster was violently opposed and rushed forward, attacking anyone in the way with his body. Just then, a slap flew at Fei Fei to get her to disengage from it. Wan Jiateng ran as hard as he could, pushing Fan Zhu and Zhao Hao apart. Everyone ran except Fan Zhu. He of course recognized this thing. He had met it before in one of the offices, but it was only a disembodied monster. But now it was quite real. Fei Fei helplessly tried to crawl forward. She couldn't stand up anymore and begged Wan Jiateng to wait for her. But the monster was already looming over her with a huge figure. "Don't leave me," she shouted to Wan Jiateng. Although she could only see Fan Zhu and Zhao Hao, and her lover had long since escaped from there. She reached out her hand to the guys in the distance, hoping for help. But the monster grabbed her hair and put a sharp medical scalpel to her face. "Save," pleaded Fei Fei. "Save me," shouted the girl with her last strength. But the scalpel was already placed against her throat. Her face was full of empty despair and tears, but she didn't manage to say anything else but wheezing. The monster slit her throat like butter. Zhao Hao covered his eyes with his hand. It was beyond his strength to watch such a murder. He couldn't believe that the girl had been killed. "Fei Fei," he called out. But Fei Fei already had her head twisted because it was almost separated from her body. The monster swung the scalpel again. The nurse continued to poke, cut, tear, and dismember, although the girl was already dead of course. Fan Zhu noticed that the nurse had a very fine sense of how to use the scalpel, apparently having performed many surgeries in this hospital before she died. Even though she and Zhao Hao are side by side, it doesn't stop her from abusing Fei Fei's body. After all, you can't operate on several patients at the same time. You should always focus on just one for a good result. The monster removed her medical mask from her face, ready to snack on her prey. The nurse licked the bloody scalpel and placed it right between her breasts, where she apparently kept it. And then her mouth became huge. Huge fangs came out and she aimed at Fei Fei's head, ready to devour her. Fan Zhu suggested that the monster's cannibalism was more of an instinct, and the scalpel was its way of killing her. Zhao Hao looked at Fan Zhu with suspicion silently. But then the guy walked forward towards the monster. The monster was busy eating the corpse very greedily, gnawing into the bones and veins, and Fan Zhu crept up behind her. He took a good swing. He hit the monster's head as hard as he could. But suddenly, he realized that the blow was useless. His hand was bloody and the monster didn't even stagger. Hard as steel. It seems that all the monsters they had seen before had such strength that a human couldn't resist them. He looked at his battered arm, covered in blood, and thought that apparently the only way to change the situation was to become an Esper. Zhao Hao called out to him and said that it was time to get out of here. But Fan Zhu continued to think. The monster has a strange way of killing just one person from the crowd at a time and at a very precise interval. First it catches them, then it kills them and cuts them up, then it devours them. It turns out that the safest time is when it is devouring its prey. Zhao Hao pointed out that the monster with its appetites wouldn't mess around with this body for long. Fan Zhu only said that it would take the monster more than 3 minutes to eat the shapely and not small Fei Fei. All the flesh. Zhao Hao felt nausea rise to his throat. He immediately threw up on the floor. And Fan Zhu said that Wan Jiateng said that to become an Esper, one needed to pass their power through a human soul. Surely in a place imbued with the energy of these things, the process would go much faster. Suddenly, he noticed the monster's legs, covered in stockings that were quite shabby. Because of the broken body, the monster was sort of upside down. The upper part was chest down and the lower part was belly up. Suddenly, Fan Zhu raised his hand and slapped the monster right on the thigh. From the outside, it looked absolutely amazing. A guy grabbing the thigh of a monster with a broken body that was twice his size. The monster did not react and continued to devour the flesh of its victim. Zhao Hao clutched his head in fear and shock. He had no idea that Fan Zhu would risk doing something like this. He said that although he had watched a lot of videos of the corresponding vulgar genre, but not so much that he would try to grope a murderous otherworldly creature. Fan Zhu ran his fingers over the nurse's leg and said that if Zhao Hao didn't want to stay, he could leave, and he still had things to do here. The guy with glasses immediately bit his lip and fell silent, wondering whether he should stay or not. "You pervert. All right, come on," he shrieked, clutching his eyes. It was hard to resist such an extraordinary situation. To drop the monster that was devouring their former colleague and would most likely go after them. Zhao Hao moved closer and sat down awkwardly next to Fan Zhu. They just stared at their object of interest in silence for a while. Suddenly, the guy with glasses reached out with his hand with a look as if this leg was something he needed to rip off rather than touch. He ended up slapping his hand on the monster's leg. One had to notice that they were quite beautiful legs, slender, and if they didn't belong to the devouring creature, Fan Zhu would probably be able to think of something more, although he might have thought about it. But Zhao Hao didn't really like it, for the monster was the demonized remains of a dead person, which were absolutely ice cold. No blood had flowed there for a long time. How cold, the guy hissed. He kept his hand on the skin in silence for a while. Suddenly, a small red glow enveloped his hand and supernatural powers manifested themselves at the point of contact between the otherworldly creature and the living man. The monster was completely oblivious to anything but its succulent prey, greedily gushing blood from the flesh that hadn't even cooled down yet. Zhao Hao asked if Fan Zhu felt something strange like him. He replied that he didn't feel anything. The guy with glasses blushed red in a flash, but he didn't pull his hand away. There is a contact. Suddenly, Zhao Hao decided to be candid and said that he couldn't believe the first time he touched a woman's leg. And then he admitted that even a livid dead creature, this part of the body is quite beautiful, the skin is soft. The guy with glasses had already started drooling. It seems that he hardly ever touched girls before. Fan Zhu noticed that this guy adapted quickly, and although he was scared at first, but now, perhaps there was something in him after all. Fan Zhu distracted his companion by saying that about a minute and a half had already passed and the monster would start hunting again very soon. The guy with glasses nodded awkwardly and agreed. 1:29, the timer prompted. 1:30, here we go. Let's go, shouted Fan Zhu, jumping up from his seat. The guy with glasses immediately ran after him, leaving the monster behind. He asked if it was a good idea to run away, or if he was already here and at least knew what to do and where to go. The guy ran silently, trying to focus on the layout of the building to at least find a dead end. When he entered the building, he was able to memorize its layout and main corridors. Knowing the layout of the building, they would be able to escape from it. The corridor was dark and seemed to narrow all the time, creating an oppressive atmosphere in an already not very pleasant place. Suddenly, a familiar black hair fell right on top of Fan Zhu's head and he immediately froze. How was this possible? Had she really changed her strategy? They still had 2 minutes left. Why was she chasing after them? The nurse monster dangled from the ceiling, and from her, one could feel the aura of a spider woman who had caught little gnats in her web. Fan Zhu looked up in panic, and then he realized everything. Fei Fei had. Of course, he was being overtaken by a monster, but he kept running and turned around slightly to confirm his theory. She had implants. They were the only ones left lying where her body was. Apparently, the monster didn't like chewing rubber. Implants, who knew? The monster had already pounced on him from behind, ready to tear him apart. Fan Zhu froze. There was no point in running. He was caught. God, let there be no silicone in heaven. That was his last thought as the nurse swung her sharp scalpel. But suddenly, the script stopped. He opened his eyes and surprisingly he was alive. On Fan Zhu's face was genuine surprise, like the first day he woke up in this distorted reality, not realizing what was wrong after all. It was as if he was slightly glitching, the image in front of his eyes flickering and rippling like a broken television set. Suddenly he came to his senses, as if waking up. And here he was again, pawing at the thigh of the monster that should have devoured him just moments ago. What was this all about? He rolled back in time to when he was groping the monster. Zhao Hao was already sitting beside him and blushingly engaging in the same act of obscenity. He looked at his cell phone, checking the time counter. This is all so strange, but it seems he is preserved in a certain place before he dies. 1:01. He had 30 more seconds. It all reminded him of a level system like in a game. The first was an apartment, the second was this hospital. The guy with glasses next to him paid no attention to anything but the soft and very cold skin under his palm while Fan Zhu pondered. Even though he didn't have too much time, he had apparently already passed the first level, so he would automatically be saved for the second level. That's right, Fei Fei also has implants in his chest. You can't make the same mistake a second time. Meanwhile, the monster had already done a good job on the girl's body, with some ribs sticking out, some insides, but otherwise everything was eaten. It was a bit paradoxical to look at the insides of someone you had seen alive for 5 minutes. But Fan Zhu is not a man of deep emotions. He just grabbed Zhao Hao by the scruff of his neck and dragged him away while they still had precious seconds. The man grimaced. "Let me touch it some more." The guy with the glasses howled. He replied that the monster had already gotten to the silicone in his chest, meaning they were out of time. Implants, so big. Seemed like Zhao Hao was a bit disappointed by the fact that Fei Fei's breasts weren't real all this time. As if it mattered when she was already dead. Fan Zhu rushed down the stairs and pushed his partner up. Suddenly, on one of the flights, they encountered Wan Jiateng and the troublemakers who hadn't been caught yet. Fan Zhu called out to the man leaning over the railing, but the man immediately screamed in panic and told everyone to run. The guy decides to jump down to the lower span. Someone on the staff yelled not to touch him, but he wasn't going to, just landed and then stood in front of Yu Da Hai. The one shouted that he thought the two of them had already been eaten. It was amazing that they were still alive. Zhao Hao appeared from behind and asked everyone why they were all running so slowly. Immediately, the disgruntled and tired people turned to him and told him that they weren't slow. They've already gone 20 floors, and there's no end in sight. And besides, why run faster? Said a guy. 20 floors, said Zhao Hao, rubbing the back of his head thoughtfully. He said that the two of them had only gone down 3 floors and had already found them. This can't be happening, don't fool me. The staff were at the end of their nerves because no one fully understood what was going on. Wan Jiateng suddenly raised his voice and panikedly said that those things were definitely hiding in the walls. His face was covered in a layer of sweat. He was all pale like wax. His behavior was also threatening to make him nervous. The man grabbed one of the workers by the shoulders and shook him, shouting as his older brother told him that these creatures could create illusions like changing walls and space, whether it was expanding or shrinking. Wan Jiateng continued to panic, but said that once a man fell into this trap, he was doomed to be imprisoned in it for the rest of his days because the monsters can warp space and time. Warp space. Fan Zhu was immediately interested, but didn't say anything. The guy silently listened to the hysterical, nervous shouts and arguments echoing off the walls of the endless staircase. Suddenly, he walked over to them and caught their attention. Throw your things where you have already passed, Fan Zhu suggested. Wan Jiateng immediately ordered everyone to make notches on the walls and throw some things on the floor. Everyone started rummaging through their bags and pockets for whatever they could find. Someone pulled out a lighter and a pack of cigarettes, someone else an empty water bottle, and someone else a sudden condom. Fan Zhu told everyone to follow him down the stairs. Wan Jiateng didn't really trust this idea. He was scared, but there wasn't that much choice. Everyone started to quickly go down the stairs. But Fan Zhu felt something wrong. There was a lot of strange energy around. He staggered down the stairs, until he stopped himself and ordered everyone else to do the same. Just then, Zhao Hao's hand grabbed his shoulder. He asked what it was ahead at the bottom of the stairs, and at the bottom was a water bottle, a pack of cigarettes, and other things that had been thrown away earlier. So the space was looped after all. They were essentially walking in circles. Some workers panicked as they recognized their discarded items. A flashlight, a wallet, some change. That's it, that's enough. It's an illusion, there's nothing you can do about it, shrieked some girl. If you fall into this trap, you will die. Fan Zhu walked closer to the items. He picked up the discarded condom and twirled it critically in his hand, examining it. Wan Jiateng tried to calm everyone down and said that his brother had told him that only an Esper could see all these illusions, but a normal person couldn't. He suggested that everyone should test to see who could manifest these psychic spirit abilities. Everyone turned around incomprehensibly, although no one objected strongly. Wan Jiateng put his hands together, either in prayer or in an attempt to concentrate. He tried some sort of speech, perhaps able to manifest the powers of an Esper. I don't know at what point I'll be captured, but I want to manifest the powers of an Esper before my demise. If I can become one, everyone in the family will respect me. The man said. Not that anything much changed at that moment. Someone asked how to check if the power had manifested, but the second employee said he had no idea. They all decided to follow Wan Jiateng's lead and see if it worked. But Fan Zhu decided to step aside towards the stairs. He was examining the passage and something in the wall seemed strange and suspicious to him. He remembered that the old hospital plan didn't have an elevator, but there was a staircase next to it, which meant that it could be preserved in the current layout as well. Wan Jiateng suddenly got distracted from his futile attempts to awaken some strength and turned around. He asked where Fan Zhu was going, and the latter was already stretching his arms and was determined to find a chance to escape from here. Instead of praying, it was better to focus on finding a way out. Zhao Hao was also optimistic. He was encouraged by the sight of Fan Zhu. From the beginning, he was as calm as a boa constrictor. Even when the nurse monster appeared, he didn't run headlong forward, but as if he was stuck to the wall. Wan Jiateng was tense about all this because it was impossible not to know something special and be calm in an extreme situation involving monsters, the supernatural, and the parallel spirit world. He remembered that they all ran to the elevator without the two of them and Fei Fei, who had no doubt been dead for a long time. The man wondered how the two of them could even spend so much time with this creature without the monster killing them as soon as it noticed them. He rubbed his chin and a strange thought popped into his head. There was no way that nurse. In his imagination, the cute little ghost girl had fallen for two young guys who were rubbing their hands together blushing. No, that's ridiculous. That can't be true. But then why? He couldn't find a good explanation. The staff members looked behind the boss a little puzzled. Zhao Hao was smiling and followed Fan Zhu like a bunny on his heels. Meanwhile, Fan Zhu was scrutinizing the wall with his hands, trying to find perhaps a secret passage or something. The guy with glasses asked what he was doing now, and then said that Fan Zhu would teach him and he would help him. The guy suddenly started counting out numbers in a whisper, leaning his hand against the wall. 10.11, 12. He seemed to be counting steps. When he got to 15, he stopped. He had finally found what he was looking for. Suddenly an iron door appeared in the wall, as if it had been there all along, waiting for someone very observant to solve the riddle. "Is everything all right?" asked Zhao Hao a little worriedly. They both touched the door, hoping that it wouldn't disappear under their hands and it wasn't another trick of the dark forces. Wan Jiateng immediately jumped up from his seat. "The door!" he exclaimed in shock. The man immediately reached down and pushed Fan Zhu in the shoulder, shouting that they were saved. There was finally some kind of door. But how to open it? "Just grab the handle," Fan Zhu suggested, and grabbed the iron door handle. "It will be good if the door is unlocked." He turned the handle and opened the door ajar. Immediately, dark shadows and an unpleasant energy came out of the door. It opened, after all. Behind it was some dark room. Fan Zhu took a step forward. It was pitch black, but it was safe and no one had attacked him in the first 5 seconds, which was not bad. Just then, Wan Jiateng rushed in, shouting that he was finally saved. Fan Zhu didn't share his enthusiasm, just silently watching. The other people immediately ran forward, trying to squeeze into the room faster. Zhao Hao suddenly turned to him and asked why he wasn't going with everyone else. Was he checking something again? Fan Zhu, on the other hand, thought that since they all decided to check themselves, they had better run faster if they didn't want to run into that nurse monster. Suddenly, a man of not the most pleasant appearance came at them from behind and asked why they weren't running, because if anything, he didn't want to blame himself for their deaths. "I just want to make sure I won't be the last, and the Espert's powers should be awakened soon," he thought with a smirk. Besides, he was lucky enough to be in this hospital and run into these creatures that it would be sad to part with them. The stomping of feet echoed throughout the empty and too suspiciously long room. Suddenly, Wan Jiateng stopped and put out his hands so that the rest of them would also not be in a big hurry to go anywhere else. Further down, the room split into a fork. Both corridors were completely impenetrably dark and identical. What to do? One of the employees encouraged his friend to go and check what was in one of the corridors. "You're so smart, you go." "There's no way I'm going," shouted the guy. Fan Zhu thought and waited, looking at the fork, while the others were murmuring around him because he was acting very distinguished from all the other panicking people. Wan Jiateng asked which path he would choose. "If you just found this door, then you will find the right path," someone shouted. Fan Zhu didn't like this very much. First they pushed him out of the way, and when faced with the choice between life and death for the umpteenth time, they all rely on him and ask for help. "Why don't you say something? Answer me," one of the crowd urged him on. Someone picked up on his thought and told Fan Zhu that it was no time to be important because the monster was already close and would soon catch up with them. "We forgive you because we trust you," he continued. "No, I don't care," Fan Zhu replied. He was fed up with all of them, and it wasn't that he cared much whether they all survived or not. To him, they were just expendable meat. None of them were of any value in case of danger, no matter how cynical it sounded. Fan Zhu approached one of the passageways at the fork. At this moment, the nurse was invincible. "And if everyone wants to buy time," thought the guy. The crowd remained silent. Someone has to sacrifice his life. In the corridors there was a growl and a clawing sound. Everyone immediately ran for their lives. The claws scraped the walls, leaving horrible imprints. Its voice. People immediately realized it was her. Although everyone tried to run as hard as they could, the fat and elderly Yu Dahai clearly wouldn't be able to catch up with them all. "She is already here." Fan Zhu was smiling contentedly. It seemed like he was starting to enjoy this game of catching up and wasn't afraid of anything. After all, he wouldn't die no matter how many times he was mortally wounded. The nurse crawled along the ceiling and caught up with the clumsy fat man who was trying hard to escape. But of course these attempts had little success. Her twisted body seemed crazier each new time she appeared. Twisted unnaturally long legs and arms, twisted neck and waist. She really was a spider in this place, catching small insects. Her bright yellow eyes glittered in the darkness. Everyone was screaming and cursing, pushing each other and ready to leave anyone to be torn apart, just so this thing would stop chasing them. The monster was rapidly crawling along the ceiling as if running. It jumped down from the ceiling, ready to attack Yu Dahai. But the one cared too much about its miserable life and thought that it couldn't die yet. He can't be allowed to. He grabbed the shoulder of the guy running in front of him. The fatty seemed to think that he was worth more than everyone else. "Tianzhu, you die," he decided, and just pushed him right into the clutches of the monster, who immediately swooped down on his new prey. The guy fell down in confusion, barely realizing that he had just been given away as bait. "You die," he shouted. The nurse attacked him with her scalpel and slit his throat faster than he could realize anything. "You're a fool." Those were his last words. After that, he bled out in 3 heartbeats and was torn apart by the monster's mouth. Udahai couldn't be happy about this state of affairs. "Let me escape. Thank you for such a favor," he shouted as he turned around. Fanzu was not surprised, although there was a slight disgust on his face. So much for fallen humanity, he thought, looking back at the monster that was devouring the corpse. When then is the difference between him and her? With a scalpel, the nurse cut the body open as if dissecting it. Since the monster was distracted, Fanzu could for a literal moment approach her. Now was the time to try to awaken more of its strength. There would be no more deaths. Zhao Hao turned around in panic, checking where his partner was stuck. But his eyes widened when he saw what his partner was doing again. Fanzu approached the monster again and wanted to touch her legs. He took the leg with both hands and groped a bit, testing how his Esper essence responded to it. Touching it made his heart flutter and not feel lonely, as if it was some sort of connection between his soul and otherworldly forces. And what Zhao Hao was worried about was of course just the fact of groping a woman's bare feet, no matter if they belonged to a monster, a reanimated corpse, or a real person. Zhao Hao continued to talk nonsense about how soft the skin on her thigh was, how white and neat it was like crystal. Fanzu smiled contentedly. He liked this guy. What a day, there are simply no words. The guy also decided to touch the skin under his stocking and thought that his new friend might not be able to become an Esper like him. But they could definitely escape from here together. Zhao Hao and Fanzu ran down the empty and dark corridor further, trying to find a door or another passage. Fanzu on the run asked why Zhao Hao wasn't afraid that the monster might kill him. He replied that he had a high chance of dying here anyway, so why don't they be friends? He doesn't lose anything. The guy with glasses suddenly panted to run and they slowed down their pace. "Wait, up ahead," he shouted and stopped. Fanzu looked back to where the companion was pointing. They ended up in a spacious dining room where everything looked pretty pristine. The tables and chairs were in order and it seemed that one could even find something to eat if they tried hard enough. Though of course the place wasn't perfectly clean. It was dark and you could spot cockroaches crawling back and forth. Udahai, who was behind them, offered to eat because due to overwork he doesn't have time to eat lunch and was now very hungry. There were still food containers in the kitchen if you looked for them. And the cockroaches were only getting bigger and bigger by the feel of it, though they were inevitable in any establishment that had food. Wan Jiatang immediately rejoiced at the change of location, because there was a chance of finding an emergency exit, which were usually in the canteens. And he immediately scolded the fatty, saying that he just wanted to fill his belly with food, so they should find a way out first, and then let him eat whatever he wanted. Even if he was picking up girls, he didn't care. Fanzu, however, dismissed the remark that they would not be able to enjoy them. Udahai immediately started sticking it to the boss that he didn't listen to the chatty guy and he would shut him up now. One of the female employees eventually found the door. When Jiatang immediately turned around, he was clearly flustered. He shouted to the girl not to touch anything and he would go first himself. The door was an old iron door, but there was also a small window with a grate at the top. "There's salvation," the man rejoiced. He turned the handle and the door opened. It was very dark inside, like the rest of the building, but he stepped cautiously inside. Not that the room surprised him. The man took a step forward and nothing dangerous happened. There was just another door in the distance, and there seemed to be nothing in the room. Everyone else walked in following. This oppressive atmosphere was starting to press more and more. It meant that the monsters were closing in on them. Everyone went to the next door and it too was open. It looked like this was their end. When they entered, everyone had very uncertain and disappointed faces on their faces. It was just a closet that led to nowhere. There were closets that were filled with boxes and other things. When Jiatang immediately let out a howl. "What's this? A dead end. There's no way out of here, we're trapped." He shook panically. Fanzu was a little disappointed. "It was a mistake, wasn't it? We should have gone to another passageway. Now there is no time to go back, and although some will be able to escape, they don't know how far they will have to go. How many lives will be lost?" he reasoned as he looked around the room and everyone present. Why can't he himself go back to when he was near the nurse, as he had done before? Who said he couldn't? He immediately walked back, ignoring everyone else. Zhao Hao warned him that he would fall into the clutches of the med if he walked back. People started to resent why we're here at all. It's his fault since he's the one who took the wrong path. "If you don't know which way to go, then don't give us orders," someone said. "Don't you want to talk to the person in charge?" added another employee. What can they even do now? Fan Zhu didn't really pay much attention. He was cunning and had his own plan, which of course no one would ever find out. He walked out of the room and headed back. They want to abandon him. This will be funny, he thought. Suddenly, Zhao Hao stood up for him. He turned to everyone present, and although he was very timid, he burst out in indignation. How dare you? You didn't want to choose where to go, he said. First you asked him for the way, and now you blame him for all your problems. Why didn't they choose which way to go? Yu Dahai snapped at him and immediately began to justify that this was different and no one thought it would turn out this way. He said that of course they could have chosen the path themselves, but they trusted Fan Zhu's choice. Who knew he would do that? Oh you. The guy with glasses became indignant. They almost came close and Yu Dahai did not stop talking, saying that Fan Zhu had not only undermined their trust, but also led them to certain death. Wen Jiateng separated them and said that this was no time to fight at all. They needed to figure out how to escape from this cursed place now. The man continued and said that since the monster attacks one person at a time, they have 2 or 3 minutes between attacks. And that only means one thing. They need to choose a victim and hand it over to the monster. Then they will have some chance to escape. Fan Zhu was very amused by this whole situation, walking from side to side. He laughed lightly, but suddenly Wen Jiateng started running towards him. And this victim will be you, he shouted. The man grabbed him by his shirt and said that no one wants to be in a desperate situation, so he should redeem himself. Zhao Hao immediately shouted for him to let him go. We have to help them, said the girl employee. But how? Zhao Hao ran up to Wen Jiateng and made a hand grip on his neck. He started swearing and kicking, trying to throw the guy with glasses off of him. He shouted to Yu Dahai to help him and the fat man like a faithful dog immediately ran up to both of them. He piled his huge belly on top of the guy and he let Wen Jiateng out of his hands. Zhao Hao also started cursing, which seemed a bit strange as it was unusual to hear from someone so timid. But he was ready to defend Fan Zhu to the last. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. Who closed it? One of the people present asked. It was Fan Zhu. He was standing outside, leaning against the door. The girl employee started to panic a lot and mumbled under her breath that she couldn't do anything in such a situation and covered her eyes with her hands to avoid looking at what was happening. Fan Zhu. Zhao Hao called out to him. You're crazy, said to him through the bars on the door Wen Jiateng. The guy only replied that he had always thought that he couldn't normally show feelings for people. But he didn't realize that these monsters would be so interesting. He was once again punctuated by a little hysterical laughter. Thank you for helping me take an interest in this world, he told them. Of course the nurse monster was right there and was already racing across the ceiling for her next prey. She swung her scalpel, attacking Fan Zhu, and like all of her past victims, she slit his throat. Next time, I will thank you for everything, were his last words before he bled out. His body fell to the floor in a pool of his own blood. Wen Jiateng opened the door, practically kicking it open and ran outside with the others while the monster was distracted. But Zhao Hao was not willing to run with everyone. He fell to his knees next to Fan Zhu, who was rapidly bleeding out. Fan Zhu, I'll go with you, said the guy with glasses. Wen Jiateng slowed down his running for a moment to turn around and look at them. He was satisfied that the monster was now distracted by the 2 victims and laughed. Like everyone else in this situation, he was starting to slowly go crazy and become more and more violent. But suddenly he stopped. He was struck by the scene he saw. Fan Zhu was still alive and even had the strength to smile. Zhao Hao had clasped his throat with his hands, trying to stop the blood, literally spelling out the word, wait. Blood gurgled in his throat with every extra sound. And here he was again at the beginning, sitting in front of the nurse's leg, groping her for the first time. He hesitated a bit because he didn't immediately realize where he was. Zhao Hao was beside him, as he always was. He put his hand on his shoulder and pulled him forward. It was time for them to go. But you said. But the guy with glasses didn't finish his sentence. Implants, replied Fan Zhu, hinting that they didn't have time. How big? Zhao Hao was surprised, looking at Fei Fei's corpse. It seems that even such a fearful person had developed immunity to the horrors in such a place. They walked further down the corridor. Fan Zhu quickened his step until he started running, speeding up and trying to reach the stairs faster. Since he already knew what to do, he was incredibly confident and laughed to himself. And then they saw Wen Jiateng on the stairs with the others again. The one heard a noise upstairs and raised his head up. He thought it was a monster, so he shouted to everyone to be careful. It was from above. But it was Fan Zhu and he just jumped down from the top span just like last time. Wen Jiateng immediately shouted to him, but the guy had already galloped forward, counting the steps. Why are you running so slowly? Suddenly appeared from behind Zhao Hao. One of the staff members immediately, just like that time, replied that there is no cat and no edge to this staircase. They had already descended 20 floors down. Wen Jiateng again explained that monsters can create illusion, change space and expand walls. But Fan Zhu didn't listen to him. He had already learned it all by heart and was racing down the stairs, counting the steps. The whole space is warped. When Jiateng howled, Fan Zhu counted up to 15 steps and a door appeared, which he immediately opened for all to see. Illusions, huh? He said a little jerkily. When Jiateng marveled, he had found the exit so quickly. Cool, let's go, exclaimed Zhao Hao. He was very pleased and seemed proud of his partner. And here was the dark corridor again. Suddenly suspicious, Wen Jiateng asked Fan Zhu if he was one of them, referring to the Aspers, but it sounded a bit ambiguous. You know exactly where to go if you found a way out so quickly, the man kept reasoning out loud. Wen Jiateng said that when they all got out, they would thank him. Fan Zhu checked the clock on his phone. There was still a minute left, she would be here soon. Wen Jiateng remarked that Fan Zhu must be an Asper if he could calculate the timing of the monster's movement. He decided to motivate the guy and said that he would give him 5 million if he would get him out of this endless hospital. Fan Zhu only smirked and the man was somehow dumbfounded, not knowing what to expect. Anyone would be happy with such a deal, but the guy was only interested in monsters. Fan Zhu replied that no one should jump to conclusions or rewards for him. He still had things to do here. The man didn't really understand him. For him to stay in such a place for his own interest was too wild an idea. What business? He barely had time to ask. Fan Zhu suddenly turned around and kicked Wen Jiateng in the groin with his knee, causing him to jump up in shock. Fan Zhu had made an omelet, so to speak. The man's face twisted into a grimace. He wheezed and wept. With a scream, he fell to his knees, clasping his hand between his legs, trying to fight through the pain, while Fan Zhu watched the scene a bit sadistically, smirking. Wen Jiateng almost turned into a dried tomato. His face was red and curled up, sweating, and the sensation of the blow must have been inexpressible. He thought that apparently this amount would not be enough. You will answer, Wen Jiateng muttered unconfidently, not even able to get up from the floor. Fan Zhu calmly and contentedly watched him squirming on the floor. Yu Dahai immediately resented why Fan Zhu did that, and the guy behind him picked up on the idea and asked why he had to hit him, even on the most painful spot. Fan Zhu shrugged and said that Beast was so fast that it would take him less than a minute to kill everyone here. If Wen Jiateng loses his strength, he will definitely become prey. Consider that I helped you, finished Fan Zhu while watching the other people's reactions. Us? Aren't you confused? Yu Dahai scratched his bald head questioningly. Zhao Hao only nodded in agreement, supporting his comrade's opinion. But the guy had not finished his revenge yet. He swung his leg again and made a second portion of omelet. Now Yu Dahai shouted and made a painful face. You must die, said Fan Zhu watching the fat man panting in pain. Yu Dahai didn't even say anything but mumbled under his breath, falling to his knees and resting his forehead on the floor. He didn't survive this any easier than Wen Jiateng. Apparently the fatty had never been hit like this before, so he was almost foaming at the mouth. Even Zhao Hao, who had supported him most of the time, clutched his groin defensively, feeling the phantom pain, and said that perhaps Fan Zhu was too tough. What do you even need to do? Why do you need to beat them? One of the staff members resented. Okay, beating Wen Jiateng to buy time, but Yu Dahai, why would you beat them? The employee persisted. Fan Zhu carelessly replied that it was just in case. Zhao Hao was delighted by Fan Zhu's coolness, albeit somewhat ostentatious, while giving a thumbs up approvingly. But the other people were not so optimistic and were discussing what they would do if Fan Zhu's friend went crazy again and pulled some unpredictable nonsense. Is he normal or what? One of the people asked. Fan Zhu stood at the fork and announced to everyone that if they went to the right, they would die, and if they went to the left, they would survive. There wasn't much time left. The guy crossed his arms on his chest and sighed as if he was doing everyone a big favor by staying here at all. The same employee who'd been outraged earlier asked why he didn't go left first, if it was a safe way. Does he want to use them as bait for the monster to rip them apart? Fan Zhu said that they would have 10 seconds to escape while he was thrashing the monster's thigh. The staff members were naturally surprised and didn't understand anything. But the humble guy with glasses, Zhao Hao, glowed with happiness and asked him to stay by Fan Zhu's side so that he could touch the monster a little. The monster nurse didn't have to wait long. Within a couple of seconds, she came crawling after the new victim. The people screamed in fear and decided to run to the left as Fan Zhu had told them earlier. They all rushed towards the corridor. It wasn't very long, but it was very dark, so they hid behind a wall and looked out from around the corner to see what was going on where the others were left. The girl and guy staff looked out, ready to run if the monster crawled towards them. And Fan Zhu was standing in front of Yu Da Hai and Wan Jai Teng sitting on the floor, waiting for the monster to bite off all the limbs. And the nurse was already crawling along the ceiling closer to her prey. Wan Jai Teng raised his head. There was some blood on the floor before him and asked Fan Zhu one last time to help him. But something made him uneasy. It was somehow too wet here. He lifted the hand he used to hold his groin after the blow, and it was covered in blood. Just like his white pants, blood was dripping from them. Fan Zhu seemed to have overdone the punch. Wan Jai Teng stretched his hand towards the guy and shouted that he had killed his potential children. But Fan Zhu only stepped on his hand before an unpleasant characteristic crunch was heard. The guy sat down on one knee in front of him and said that he was still not going anywhere for now. "I'll watch you die," the guy said. The nurse's hands in dirty and worn gloves took Wan Jai Teng's head while he was in shock. He barely had time to shout something before the monster snapped his neck in one motion. Then it simply ripped his head off his body, splattering blood everywhere. Naturally, the blood splashed onto Fan Zhu's face. He wasn't too upset and licked some of the liquid off his lips. As expected, this was the taste of revenge. Fan Zhu combed his bangs upwards with his hand wet with blood without even wiping his face. "Don't take offense," he said to the corpse of Wan Jai Teng, who would certainly not have said anything back to him by now. Suddenly, his heart beat too fast, leaving a pressing and painful sensation on his left side. The guy grabbed his chest, trying to take away the pain. It was as if his heart was about to burst. Hysterical laughter burst out of Fan Zhu. But suddenly, he heard the familiar and hateful "Bunny." He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or not. It seemed to him that his so-called wife was standing next to him and calling out to him. Or maybe she was really there. All he could think of was that the day would come when he would kill her. What bliss that would be. He found himself sitting in front of the monster's legs, groping her feet. While the monster was devouring their former acquaintance, Fan Zhu was sitting very incongruously between her legs, trying to grope for something. "Is he really going to touch her?" one of the staff members incredulously interjected. The guy's face was still covered in dried blood and he looked back at everyone. Zhao Hao awkwardly stood by the side and watched the scene. Suddenly, he wept for some reason and said that he had not abandoned Fan Zhu and would be by his side. But suddenly, Zhao Hao's face changed and seemed to be afraid. Together, he offered to touch Fan Zhu's monster, but it had a horrible aura and his eyes were glowing, and it was as if he had begun to turn into an entity. People panicked because it was unclear whether Fan Zhu had become a monster or not. Monster. It was like the guy woke up. He wiped the blood off his face as best he could, and although it sobered him up a bit, it didn't justify his recent highly questionable actions. It turns out, after 20 deaths and a revenge that wasn't even justified in this timeline, he's already starting to get crazy. Fan Zhu suddenly realized this. He looked at the severed head of Wan Jai Teng that was lying somewhere on the floor. Fan Zhu realized that he had already stopped showing any sympathy and would not be able to regain his humanity. However, Zhao Hao was the one who kept him afloat, sobering him up a bit because he was a simple guy who didn't really enjoy watching people being tortured. "He's unlike me." Fan Zhu started a thought but never finished it. If he doesn't want to, he won't force it. But suddenly, it was as if Zhao Hao woke up and decided something for himself, and then caught Fan Zhu's attention. "I'm a loser from an ordinary family," he began. "Of all these people, only you let me go with you, only you have become a friend to me." These words really hurt Fan Zhu. He began to even feel something again. "I believe you," said Zhao Hao, awkwardly scratching his cheek. But Fan Zhu just woke up for a second and then went back to his normal state. The guy with glasses did not ignore this and noticed that Fan Zhu had changed, looking like he was possessed by a beast. The guy was hurt by this, although he didn't show it, so he just kept silent. Suddenly, when Zhao Hao wanted to get closer to his friend, he accidentally bumped into Wan Jai Teng's head. The guy immediately shrieked and skidded on one leg. He rhetorically asked if Wan Jai Teng had become his prey. But the guy with glasses was more concerned about the monster's thigh, which he swiftly reached out his hand to touch. And both of them touched at the same time. Well, nothing happened. It was just cold bluish skin, slightly stained with cadaverous spots. He moved his hand from side to side, poking and probing. He was squinting, not knowing what exactly was going to happen. Zhao Hao enjoyed it more and blushed as usual, but then asked why Fan Zhu had attacked the two of them. The one replied that this thing ran faster than them, so it was necessary to sacrifice someone else's lives in exchange for time. If he didn't choose the two of them, then who would they give to the monster? Him himself, the one opposing them, or Zhao Hao, who meant nothing to them? The guy with glasses stammered a bit and didn't know how to react normally. Suddenly, there was a shift in energy and something finally started to happen. Fan Zhu instantly felt an unfamiliar sensation and asked his partner to be quiet. "Do you also feel this piercing coldness?" asked Fan Zhu. But Zhao Hao did not feel anything. He was as usual, so it didn't show, said Fan Zhu. His face was both surprised and completely blank at the same time. There was an energy from the monster that flowed through his entire body as if it was a vein. Did the monster's power penetrate into him? His hand, where he touched the monster, seemed to merge skin to skin, transmitting energy. He didn't feel this energy at first, but when they reached the tipping point, could this be an omen of the awakening of power? Zhao Hao basically only pampered around, pawing at the monster's leg and saying that if it was cold, he could warm it up. Eventually, he got bored of it and told Fan Zhu that it was time for them to leave. But he told him to leave because, like Yu Da Hai, he had sensed a point of energy concentration. Meanwhile, the fatty himself was on the monster's lunch line and could no longer crawl or run away anywhere. "Really? But we should be able to escape then?" Zhao Hao asked uncertainly. Then he clarified that he could sense this mysterious energy, but he couldn't materialize it. Fan Zhu thought for a moment, and then replied that it was because he had no choice between life and death, so even with such close contact, Zhao Hao could not feel what he felt. At this time, the monster was massacring Yu Da Hai, and unlike the others, it didn't kill him quickly and devour him, but it was fundamentally leaving him alive for longer, so the fatty was screaming terribly. Blood splattered on Zhao Hao, but he didn't even blush, only thinking that he had actually known Fan Zhu for quite a long time and didn't recall him standing on the brink of life and death. The monster seemed to genuinely enjoy killing, licking the skin with its long tongue. And Fan Zhu had remarked that since Yu Da Hai didn't burden himself with dieting, it would probably take the monster at least 5 minutes to deal with him. Fan Zhu said that they had been sitting here pawing at the nurse for 2 minutes, and after 3, it was already time to rush out. Zhao Hao agreed. Fan Zhu concentrated on trying to concentrate his energy. It was as if his body began to fill with a kind of aura engulfing him. It was an unfamiliar feeling to him. He was establishing a connection with the other world, discovering new limits to his body. He could feel this all-indefinable sensation entering his body, but what was it going through? For Fan Zhu, it was as if forces were passing through all of his veins, concentrating in his head and heart. Could it be that it was passing through his spirit? His heart was overwhelmed by this magic, energy, power, or whatever it was. The soul is amorphous, only an esper can give it form. His heart absorbed all the energy into itself. Gaining this kind of power was comparable to cutting a body into pieces, as if a nurse had deftly cut Fan Zhu's body apart with her scalpel. It was a strange sight, if Zhao Hao was even able to see what was happening to his partner. But Fan Zhu felt as if he had been turned inside out and revealed his essence on the outside, covered in a bright light. Energy was gathering at one point, ephemeral and elusive, but it could create the new and tangible. From this power emerged a kind of red crystal, similar to the kind of divination spheres that were usually just a backlit ball. But this one was real, getting bigger and bigger. Fan Zhu's heart was being torn and put back together, figuratively of course, but this force was doing terrifying things to his body. It was as if his body was a porcelain vase that had been broken again and again, exposing the places through which his soul's transformation was going through. But here Fan Zhu found himself back in reality, still sitting in front of the monster, and Zhao Hao was beside him. But his body had changed. The sensation, the sense of smell, hearing, and now he could taste and understand the entire palette of flavors. At that moment, the nurse monster was finishing off the meat and nibbling the bones like a stray dog. The boy licked a drop of blood that got on his face. His brain overflowed with new information and impulses. This was beyond all his expectations. He had become stronger and smarter in such a short time. Now the true essence of this world was appearing before him. Is this the power? Now I can use it too, the boy pondered. Of course he felt this surge of energy, the change in his body, the development of his senses, but he still wasn't sure what it gave him, because he was acting intuitively. He figured his powers had only awakened by a negligible 1%. His hands glowed with a blue light, showing him the effects of the new energy. Therefore, he would need to merge with these monsters many more times to gain their full power. Esper's abilities are the power of an awakened soul. What he wants and what he needs is its manifestation. Then what does he want? He thought for a moment, until it dawned on him. Or what does his soul crave? It manifested another stream of energy, but this time it really threatened to tear his body apart. He curled up in pain. Apparently his ability. Is it pain? When he strikes, he feels intense pain. Is it that inside I'm only made up of suffering? It was of course a rhetorical question, but he asked it to himself anyway. However, when he died these 20 times, he felt almost no physical pain, only psychological torment. so he can make people feel the same way. In his mind, his soul's desire, this new power, became like people screaming in pain, who would not be able to resist his powers. Suddenly he remembered something and sighed. And then once again he laughed, and the more this dark energy affected him, the more hysterical his laughter was. He was now satisfied with his strength. Fan Zhu seemed to have forgotten in his transformation that in reality, he was only sitting next to a monster that he would soon have to quickly escape from, and a confused Zhao Hao who didn't understand what was happening. "Did you get it?" he asked the guy. But Fan Zhu was only engrossed in his fantasies of revenge against the monsters. It would be wonderful to make these monsters feel the same pain he was going through. How he longed for that. But most of all, he only wanted to massacre one creature. "Do you crave pain, my beloved wife?" he thought. Fan Zhu enjoyed the moment of gaining such a coveted power. He stood with his arms spread out, smiling contentedly and not thinking about what was going on around him, when suddenly, somewhere in his periphery, Zhao Hao's concerned voice called out to him. It snapped him out of his stream of consciousness and enjoyment. "It's been 2 minutes," said the guy with glasses. He was excited and scared. Unlike Fan Zhu, he had nothing to save himself but time and his feet. Fan Zhu only replied that he would linger and wanted to try out his abilities. Zhao Hao was nevertheless pleased that his friend had gained new strength. Just like when Jai Teng said, "You have become an Esper." "Congratulations," said the guy with a thumbs up. Fan Zhu walked forward, closer to the monster to try out his powers. After all, he was confident in himself, and besides, death didn't change anything for him except for the time rollback. The nurse was not distracted by him. She was busy devouring the remains of Yu Da Hai. Fan Zhu tried to activate his strength and act. His hands seemed to flash with a blue light. It was like fire encompassing his hand. All the pain after 21 deaths was concentrated in that fist. He swung his fists, calculating that the blow would hurt the monster, and if there were more of these deaths, he would only get stronger. He was already close to it, and the nurse still wasn't paying any attention. The more he dies, the stronger he gets, which means his abilities are limitless. "You're the first to experience this," he shouted, punching her in the face. The blow hit, she didn't dodge, but Fan Zhu still felt that something was wrong. Dissipating. His fist landed well on her face. She cringed, but she barely fell backwards. The power in his fist slowly faded away. She slumped onto her back. The scalpel fell out of her hands and landed somewhere on the floor. The nurse roared as she lifted herself up, and Fan Zhu only thought to see what effect a single blow would have, considering that it was only one insignificant percentage of his strength. His heart beat faster. Using this kind of energy was draining. The monster now had her bloody medical mask in its teeth, which she had only taken off to eat. But it looked like the effect of the blow itself was completely null. There wasn't even an abrasion on her. Maybe she put all her energy into defense. Then it didn't do any damage at all. Next time he should not strike with his fist, but use something else, some kind of weapon. But would he be able to channel his power through an object? Suddenly, he was attracted by Zhao Hao again, reminding him that it was time for them to run away. Otherwise he would take up the old routine again and try to touch the monster's legs while she was still here. Fan Zhu didn't pay attention to him, but he noticed the scalpel on the floor. Weapon? Why not use the nurse's scalpel against her? He smiled slyly. Fan Zhu bent down, and while the nurse was in a frenzy from the blow, he picked up the scalpel from the floor. But it had a strange effect. The scalpel itself seemed to be filled with dark energy. The boy felt it immediately. Even holding the object itself was hard. Too much pain and energy was coming out of it violently, filling Fan Zhu as he was affected by the supernatural power. The scalpel was heavy in his hand. He was surprised by it himself. His heart was beating very fast, just like when he had obtained the Esper power a couple of moments ago. He was filled with visions of other people's memories, the pain and suffering seeming to turn into heavy energy by itself. Fan Zhu saw countless people who were tied to medical couches. Their intestines were being vented, cut and tortured. Picking up the scalpel, he immediately felt all of her experiments on people, felt all of their bitterness. He saw how the nurse became increasingly mad and how all that energy gathered in one scalpel, which she didn't abandon even after turning into a monster. She couldn't handle all that horror and turned into a monster. But if all that negative energy is contained in the scalpel, then it turns out her true form is her as well. Will I be able to deal with her scalpel? He thought, smiling contentedly at this discovery. Zhao Hao, meanwhile, was no longer shy or afraid of anything or anyone, just literally clinging to the monster's leg, stroking and probing it. Fan Zhu asked him to move away. The one resisted at first, "Give me some more time," but then he agreed, and Fan Zhu swung his new weapon. He swung the blade at her neck, but it bounced off without even leaving a scratch. At this, the nurse wailed horribly and Zhao Hao covered her ears with his hands. It didn't work. Fan Zhu was amazed. Zhao Hao walked closer to the nurse and pulled back the collar of the uniform, not her neck, and made sure that her skin was completely smooth. How is this possible? A scalpel calmly cuts through people. But it didn't even scratch her. The guy with glasses was puzzled. However, he couldn't resist wrinkling the monster's skin while he had the chance, saying that her skin was too smooth. That's why it was so pleasant. Besides, this scalpel can cut through anyone. Fan Zhu pondered. He asked himself why the weapon was useless right now then. But then he immediately remembered something. His spirit. The scalpel should be fueled by the wielder's spirit powers, but right now, its powers were depleted. That was why it wasn't as strong as it could be. With frustration, Fan Zhu had to conclude that it looked like there was no revenge for now. The nurse meanwhile had recovered from the blow and was not about to let go of those who dared to harm her. Although she no longer had a scalpel, she had fangs, claws, and the ability to crawl on the walls and ceiling with incredible speed. Fan Zhu immediately started running, grabbing Zhao Hao by the scruff of his neck to keep up. The nurse immediately stood up on her broken legs and found herself able to think and speak adequately. She was immediately upset that her scalpel had been taken away. The two boys ran away from her and stopped in the hallway. After awakening the Asper's powers, Fan Zhu had all 5 senses sharpened. He immediately heard the presence of someone behind his back. There was definitely someone here. He began to look around. Behind one of the pillars in the hall, he found 2 people, some of the still alive employees, a guy and a girl who were scared to death. Were they the ones making the noise? Not a bad hiding place, Fan Zhu thought. Zhao Hao noticed that the corridor ended with 4 exactly the same doors and needed to decide where exactly they would go. The staff members came out of hiding, which of course scared the unsuspecting guy with glasses. The girl rejoiced that they were both fine and the guy said that they were waiting for Fan Zhu, and now he should lead them. Zhao Hao stood up for his friend instantly, saying that these 2 were so useless that they could only run and hide, and now Fan Zhu should be the one to show them the way for some reason. The boy and girl were embarrassed. They were really just relying on Fan Zhu for some reason without trying to give anything in return. The hero himself only remained silent and looked at the doors. He thought for a bit and said, "It's quite simple. There are 4 of them here. The doors are also 4. Each will enter through a different door." The other 3 were not very happy about this prospect. It was dangerous to split up. The guy objected and said that they didn't have time to run around, and he was going to spend time checking every door. Fan Zhu was fed up with this and swore. "Do whatever you want," he said and walked forward. The guy and the girl froze a bit. It was quite unexpected to hear Fan Zhu say that. Suddenly, a familiar scrambling sound was heard upstairs. Someone was crawling straight up to the ceiling. "It's already here," squealed the girl. "How could it be? Did you dispatch those 2 so quickly?" the guy asked, panicking as much as his colleague. Fan Zhu became wary. It looked like he had broken her killing scheme by taking away the scalpel. That very scalpel was in his hand and he gripped it tighter. Fan Zhu headed towards one random door. He grabbed the handle and pushed the door. Lucky it was open. "Let's go," he shouted to the others. Behind the door was a staircase to somewhere upstairs. Fan Zhu immediately ran forward. He ran ahead, then Zhao Hao caught up with him, and the boy and girl tried to run after him without being pushed. Behind them, a monster figure was rushing along the walls with an inhuman back, quickly catching up. It was already in the passage when the girl was just starting to run upwards. "And me," suddenly exclaimed the nurse, gritting her teeth. "And me," she kept repeating. The monster raced down the walls, but it cared little for people who were easy to catch. Without her scalpel, she wasn't as strong. She wanted him back. Zhao Hao and the other 2 were shaking with fear, not knowing where to run to. The guy with glasses warned Fan Zhu that the monster was already to his right. Indeed, a nurse appeared right next to Fan Zhu's face. "Knife," she shouted. The monster swung at the guy with its claws. "Mind," she continued, coming down on Fan Zhu and dropping him on the floor. The guy tried to fight back with his hands. Her mouth opened ready to bite his head off. Her teeth were many, like a shark's mouth, and it was absolutely bottomless. It seemed like there weren't even any organs inside this monster. The nurse attacked him easily and sank her fangs into his neck. He died quickly. Her face was the last thing he saw in this timeline. The western passageway was a failure. He was already reeling back as usual. Now he was in that moment before hitting Wan Jiatang and Yu Dahai and feeding them to the monster. Fan Zhu did the same as last time, kicking both of them in the groin, making them both fall down. "I can make my enemies suffer," he pondered contentedly, watching the 2 squirming in pain again. And a scalpel would be perfect for that. He grabbed the object before the Esper had even awakened as the nurse dropped it, distracted by her prey. "My scalpel," the nurse roared. Fan Zhu annoyed her by waving the scalpel in his hand. "Isn't this what you're looking for?" he asked. Fan Zhu immediately turned around and started running away, also calling Zhao Hao with him. "I can't give up now." Fan Zhu ran to one of the ruined offices, the north exit. There was an elevator in one of the walls. If he was lucky, it would even be working. The guy ran up to the elevator call panel and frantically poked at all the buttons. The elevator opened, but there already waiting for him were the familiar clawed paws of a nurse. She grabbed him and managed to crush him. Blood splattered the nearest walls. Again, this time he ran through the south exit, the monster chasing him, trying to take the scalpel away. Finally, it leaped on top of him, pinning him to the floor. He was left headless again. There's only the eastern passage left, but if it turns out to be a dead end again, there's nothing left for me to do but... Fan Zhu thought, but didn't continue the thought. Suddenly, he grimaced. "But I won't be able to." No, there's still hope. He opened another door, the last one. Though she would win in speed, he would be able to use his rebirths to anticipate her actions. Behind the door was a dim passage and a room that looked as old and abandoned as the entire building except for maybe a few rooms. In that case, he would have to memorize not only the monster's movements by heart, but this area as well. He ran forward again, examining and memorizing everything. To the left he found an emergency exit. Suddenly something thin and wispy touched his neck. It was the nurse's hair, with which she could drag like ropes. But the hair wrapped around Fan Zhu's neck too tightly, and cut off his head in one move. "The ninth death is here. I know where we need to go," he thought when he woke up. "We'll make it next time." He went back in time again. Once again, he was with Xiao Hao, Yu Dahai and Wen Jiateng. Everyone was still alive for now. He pointed to one of the passageways, saying that they should go that way. The guy with glasses was walking exactly behind Fan Zhu, and the two who were supposed to be fed to the monster were trailing behind. The nurse appeared on the ceiling again and Wen Jiateng started running forward. But the nurse paid no attention to anyone except Fan Zhu, who had already gotten quite far away from them. The monster rushed towards him. Zhao Hao fearfully called out to him, "Fan Zhu, hurry up." The guy with glasses shouted as he watched the clawed paw preparing to rip off the guy's head. But Fan Zhu already knew everything in advance. He just bent slightly to the side and the monster's arm slammed into the wall. The nurse turned her head in surprise, but the guy only smirked at him. The monster was stunned and staggered for a second because it was impossible, if not impossible, to dodge such a sudden blow to the back. Zhao Hao was also surprised. Fan Zhu only smiled and turned around from the monster and started running forward while she stood there watching. But suddenly, it rushed forward in a rage, extending its clawed paw towards him. "Die," she shrieked. But for so many deaths, he had learned her movements by heart and easily dodged. Besides, even though he hadn't awakened the powers of the Esper in this timeline, still his strength depended on the number of deaths he had. After so many deaths, he had become stronger and more experienced. Even from the blow from behind, right in his lower back, he dodged it by just stepping forward slightly. The memorization of the enemy's movements made this small fight feel like a kind of dance. Zhao Hao was delighted. And like a true fan, he was cheering and supporting Fan Zhu, saying how awesome he was. The monster wasn't going to give up for nothing. It fell to the floor with its mouth open. It then rushed forward, catching up with Fan Zhu. The one, despite his confidence, of course realized that he might not be able to escape from her perfectly this time. This time, he seemed to be able to anticipate all of her movements. Suddenly he fell to the ground, but it wasn't like he hadn't miscalculated that too. The monster swooped down on top of him just as he thought it would. Fan Zhu rolled to his side and was quickly able to crouch down to stand up, while the nurse simply sealed herself into the floor at a tremendous speed. In addition to anticipating, he was now also able to skillfully dodge. The nurse was not happy about this chase. She only wanted Fan Zhu to die quickly so that she could eat all of his insides. "Die, let me have you." She began to hiss with anger. At the end of the passage where Fan Zhu was headed, there was a door that looked like an emergency exit. The employees watching all this were shocked because they thought he was dodging so perfectly because he was an Esper. None of them of course knew that this was not his first attempt. Fan Zhu twitched and ran forward towards the aisle, the nurse keeping pace and running after him. "This is the Esper," thought Zhao Hao excitedly, admiring his friend's precise movements. Fan Zhu had already almost reached the door. He had finally found the real exit. At least that's what it said on the glowing green sign above the door, the kind that hung in any public building. "We're saved." Fan Zhu was already rejoicing. This endless running was tiring him out. But suddenly, he noticed something. The monster suddenly stopped running and attacking, and cautiously crawled on the floor. Fan Zhu stopped in surprise. This nurse wanted to say something. "Don't go," she wheezed, looking sad for some reason, and at the same time a shiver took her. Why did she stop? Fan Zhu wondered. Is she afraid? The nurse immediately ran backwards at a high speed, as if she was afraid of the exit. She rushed past Zhao Hao, crashing her chest against his face, but she didn't even stop to attack. Whatever was behind that door, even such a cruel creature was afraid of what was there. Everyone panicked and tried to dodge it, and the guy with the glasses fell to the floor. He fixed his glasses incomprehensibly, but he also noticed, as usual in his histrionic manner, that the monster's chest were certainly cold, but soft. Like the rest of her body, though. Is she gone? Where is Fan Zhu? The people asked each other. Zhao Hao ran to his friend and asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. Fan Zhu said that it would be logical to assume that she ran towards the exit. But he frowned and fell silent. Zhao Hao asked what was wrong with him. The monster immediately bounced to the side as it crashed into the door. Perhaps this door is their way to freedom. He scrutinized the door. There was a small window at the top. But perhaps there are worse creatures than her behind the door. After all, there was only darkness behind the door, and it gave off an unpleasant aura as if it were an abyss. That's the way out. The girl and the group cheered in advance. Why don't we go there? Is there a problem with this exit too? A man asked. Fan Zhu turned to them and said thoughtfully. Then he said that they would rest first and then go. Zhao Hao complained that he was thirsty as these 10 minutes of escaping from the monster had drained him of all his strength. Fan Zhu only looked at the girl and guy sitting on the floor, thinking that he wasn't sure if they could see the monster too. He closed his eyes and thought about someone else's. Then a realization of sorts came to him. He stood up abruptly, causing those who had just sat down to catch their breath to be surprised. "Let's go," he told them. They all walked forward down the corridor, with Fan Zhu leading his hand along the wall as if groping it. They sped up. The atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. They could feel the tension and unpleasant energy. The guys shriveled up fearfully. "Goodbye," Fan Zhu thought as he turned around to look at them all and walked to the door. There was a grate on top, behind which was absolute pitch blackness. There wasn't even a humming sound or any indication that there was anything behind the door. Fan Zhu put his hand towards the grate. A faint blue light seemed to emanate from his hand. Could there really be a great danger lurking behind this door? Fan Zhu opened the door. Nothing jumped out at him and there was no sign of danger, only darkness. Zhao Hao asked if they should take this path and how safe it was. Fan Zhu only said that there was nowhere to go. They should go anyway. He took a step into the darkness. Maybe his companions had followed, maybe not, but he was left alone in the room in the end, unable to see even himself. He tried to gaze into the darkness. Something here seemed unsettling and suspicious to him. Nothing could be seen in this pitch blackness. Strangely, there is a dead silence. You can't even hear your own breathing. Fan Zhu may not have noticed, but the space around him was changing, distorted as if through a broken lens, the silence only adding to it. He scratched his cheek thoughtfully, feeling the full spectrum of incomprehensible sensations from an incomprehensible place. The entire path was shrouded in darkness, so he could basically only go forward. Only forward. The further he walked and repeated to himself to move forward, the more space warped. It was as if he were walking upside down, in absolute darkness, hearing and feeling nothing, and not even thinking about those behind him. I've lost track of time, he thought. It's like I'm wandering down an endless corridor. Fan Zhu wandered in this darkness for a while. Suddenly he opened his eyes. It was light again. He saw a glimpse of the light of the real world. White Willow Academy. The guy would close his eyes and find himself in darkness, and when he opened his eyes, he would see glimpses of light. In outline, he saw a large building in the setting sun. Fan Zhu opened his eyes and saw everything more clearly, the wooden panels at the entrance, the large doors. And now he woke up here, standing on the threshold of White Willow Academy, alone, safe and without any hint that what had happened to him was true. He turned around and saw an ordinary apartment building with a garage and a yard. "I'm back," he whispered in a dazed voice. Then he found his companions too. They all got out together, unbeknownst to him. Zhao Hao, the guy and the girl happily ran away from this place through the park. "It worked. We escaped from there," the guy with glasses shouted joyfully. The guy said that they should hurry up and get out of here instead of standing around waiting for something. The girl only looked around in disbelief. Did it really work out? Zhao Hao looked around, looking for Fan Zhu, who had fallen behind them. He finally saw him and said that it was time for them all to leave. "The monsters won't be able to get out of there," the guy with glasses said. "No," Fan Zhu assured him. "They're staying there." "That's right. That mental hospital from another reality is no longer." Excitedly, he pondered why only the academy was left. They couldn't get in there anymore. Why then could the monsters get outside the hospital? Zhao Hao called out to him again and said that he was very tired. It was already time to go home. Going to work tomorrow anyway. The guy with glasses sighed disappointedly. He doesn't even need a day off. Home to work? Fan Zhu asked in disbelief. Yeah, home now and work in the morning. How else? Zhao Hao shrugged nonchalantly. Fan Zhu was dumbfounded when it actually occurred to him that he had gotten out of this place. And he didn't sense anything supernatural anymore. No, I can't see anything anymore. The guy looked around in panic, trying to see the otherworldly creatures outside like he had done before. No, I can't yet, he thought, and ran out of the park at full speed. Fan Zhu, what are you looking for? Shouted Zhao Hao after him. It can't be. It's all gone. The city was a normal evening, with buildings, no monsters on the streets, no bloody sky, and no aura in the air. Fan Zhu could accept that he had just gotten away with it all, except that it was as if the hospital had just vaporized, as if it had never existed. He ran out to the road where cars were rushing by and stretched his arm out to the side as if he wanted to catch a hitchhiker. Zhao Hao immediately shouted for him to go back. It was very dangerous to stand on the open road. But Fan Zhu couldn't accept that all those monsters that had caused him so much harm, pain and death were gone. But also along with this cursed place, his Esper abilities were also gone. He was himself again. How, then, would he get revenge on them? Especially his wife, whom he had locked up at home, or she would kill him again. He watched as a car sped towards him, signaling for him to get out of the way. Only I can kill her, Fan Zhu decided. The headlights were getting closer and closer, but the guy didn't move. He hoped that this monster did not disappear from the apartment as the cursed space disappeared. Wife, you and I will meet again. He finally caught a cab and rode in a plain yellow car to his house with a middle-aged driver. The driver looked out the rearview window at the dejected look of his customer, sighing as Fan Zhu muttered something to himself. No, it can't be. They couldn't have disappeared. At least she couldn't. Fan Zhu whispered to himself in despair. The topic of revenge was already almost sticking for him. That wife, couldn't she have escaped? He said, his eyes already looking as if he had gone mad. The cab driver alerted him that they had arrived. He didn't even have time to name the amount for the ride before Fan Zhu sped off. The guy jumped out of the car and ran towards the entrance. The cab driver yelled at him to come back. What about the money? The driver shouted as Fan Zhu ran out the door. The guy started to climb the stairs slowly at first. Then he accelerated and jumped several at a time, trying to get to the door of his apartment faster. Anyone could disappear in this world, but only she alone. Beloved, he shouted and swung open the door, which wasn't even locked. Only she alone can't. But the apartment was empty. He walked in and was greeted by nothing but silence, not even a sign that anyone but him lived there. He was all shaken with grief, as if his real wife had left him, not the monster that had killed him time after time. Fan Zhu collapsed on the floor. The guy was drenched in cold sweat. You can kill me as many times as you want, but you can't bring me back to normal, he said into the void. He found the strength to get up from the floor. That wife was no longer there. Fan Zhu crouched and terribly annoyed sprinted to the bed. More than a dozen times his so-called wife and the monster nurse had humiliated him, and only his hatred for them had kept him going all this time. He reached the door to his room, and when he opened it he leaned his shoulder against the jamb for a second. If only he had the strength to crawl to his bed. I swear I'll find a way to get back at those things, he promised himself, to let them feel all the suffering he'd experienced. The sun had long since set when he finally went to bed. The night had passed like a snap, and already the rays were shining through the unshaded window. However, right now, it was the monsters that had disappeared. Fan Zhu was lying on the bed, wearing the same street shirt and pants, with a face as if he had been lying there without moving all night, but had never been able to fall asleep. How am I going to fill this void inside me now? He pondered. His face was completely indifferent and tired. What would he have to live for now? But suddenly his cell phone rang, which he kept on the bed at the side of his pillow. He picked up the receiver, putting the caller on speakerphone. Immediately a voice alerted him to the breaking news. The academy had burned down at 7:49 p.m. last night. All the tiredness immediately left his face. He moved on the bed. He nervously ruminated on what had happened. He had a news article about the incident open on his phone. There was the following information. Yesterday at 1949, an uncontrolled fire broke out. The area of the fire was about 1000 m2. The fire brigade arrived only by 22. At 12 at night there was a collapse of the building. The victims of the fire are 11 people: Zhao Hao, Yu Dahai, Fan Zhu, Lai Fei, and other several names. After reading this article and seeing his name among the list of the dead, Fan Zhu burst into hysterical laughter. This is ridiculous, I died too. My brain is fluttering. he shouted, laughing and covering his face with his hand. This means that not all is lost yet. Now he knows where these things are hiding. This is just another one of their tricks. My love, he whispered. We'll meet soon. Suddenly, he received a message from Yu Da-hai. Fanzu, why aren't you there yet? It said. A bunch of similar messages with the same content followed. Fanzu was amused as he watched this. The deceased Yu Da-hai is sending him messages. Very interesting. The number of messages passed several dozen. Some monster was spamming messages to him. The dead still call me to work, laughed Fanzu. Here he is a clever capitalist, even after death. Suddenly, something red crawled across the phone screen. Fanzu was shocked to see the familiar blood-red characters right on top of the screen glass, just like the first day he was in this reality when he saw the characters on the ceiling. You think we don't know where you are? It said. Bubbling flesh, or maybe it was smoke, emerged from that inscription, covering the screen with itself. It was another monster. This bubble quickly turned into a big eye. Fanzu, you can see me. The favorite phrase of all monsters. The eye became bigger and stared down at the guy with its pupil. Now it won't be long before you go to work, the eye said with whatever it was saying. Apparently, the dead Yu Da-hai had turned into this and was now pestering its workers even after death. That's enough, said Fanzu and grabbed that entity in his fist like a kitten. He just ripped the parasite off his phone. This is all fun of course, but don't break my phone, rebuked the monster Fanzu. But the monster just dissipated in my hand like smoke. An illusion. Wow, we have to find whoever did this, he decided. He rode his bicycle again, just like the first time, to his place of work. Fanzu got off his bike and looked up at the building. Everything was burnt in cinders, soot, although the building itself was still standing, and the whole thing was fenced off with yellow police tape. Although no one but Fanzu himself was here, everything had burned to the ground, that was for sure. He lifted the yellow tape above his head and walked behind it. Just in case, he looked around to see if anyone was here. He'd have to get some information out of what was left of the building. But surprisingly, there were people in the courtyard. Employees in tattered and torn clothes, but looking more alive than they should. There was even Fei Fei here, although she had been torn apart by a monster nurse many a time ago. She immediately ran up to him, noticing that he had arrived a bit early today. Her shirt was torn, as was her skirt, but there was no damage on her herself. Fanzu knew from past bad experiences with the monster that Fei Fei had implants in her breasts. But he touched this version of her, checking if they were real or not. The girl didn't push him away, only ostentatiously embarrassed. Ha, me too, he thought and pushed the girl, walking away from her. He walked up the stairs to the entrance. Just then, Zhao Hao appeared at the entrance, wearing the same drab clothes but otherwise being himself. He asked Fanzu had he been forcibly summoned to work today just like the others. Fanzu was surprised. Apparently Yu Da-hai was sending such texts to everyone. But what did it all mean? And to the guy with glasses, he replied that he just liked so he came. Then Fanzu asked where Yu Da-hai was now. They both went into the building and Zhao Hao pointed to the passageway, saying that the fat man was now in his office. All the employees were sitting at their computers in the burned-out room as if nothing had happened, with charred furniture, and looking just as dusty. I wonder how their computers worked after the fire. They are too alive for the dead. What really happened here? Fanzu pondered. The guy arrived at the manager's office and barely had time to enter before he was immediately called out. Why did you come just now? I've texted you a bunch of times. Why aren't you answering texts? Yelled Yu Da-hai at him, pointing his finger. So, where is my prize? Fanzu asked indifferently, just attracting the fat man's attention. Yu Da-hai immediately shouted again. How could he have the nerve to ask for a bonus with such little merit? Ah, even from beyond the grave, you piss me off. Fanzu rolled his eyes. The fatty immediately changed his face. His forehead veins swelled and his eyes turned red. What did you say? From the other world. Yu Da-hai couldn't stop. Now the whole department was watching their argument, taking a break from business to look at them. How dare you, I'm the most alive. The fat man was clearly hurt by the guy's words. He hit the target. Yu Da-hai had already cursed, but suddenly Fanzu threw himself at him. He immediately attacked. The fatty's face twisted in pain. He wheezed, because Fanzu had already slashed his throat with the familiar scalpel that he still had even after he supposedly escaped from the hospital. He pulled out the scalpel and watched as Yu Da-hai wheezed and blood poured from his throat. His gaze was icy. Killing a dead man might have been an interesting experience for him. My throat. Yu Da-hai burst out while he could still speak. Then he fell to the floor in a puddle of his own blood. You're already dead, said Fanzu. But suddenly, something caught his attention from the direction of the work office. All the employees stood up from their seats like puppets and stood absolutely still. And Zhao Hao froze as well. Fan Zhu excitedly walked over to him and waved his hand in front of his face. At first there was no reaction. Then, the glasses guy's face seemed to explode and began to swell, turning into some impossible monstrous shapes. Zhao Hao's body was tearing and turning into a monster. Apparently now they had all become mere shadows of themselves by transforming into this. Transforming, Fan Zhu thought. But he wasn't frightened and didn't even twitch. Just watched as his friend transformed into a monster. The creature roared terribly as it transformed, as if it was physically painful for him. Fan Zhu gripped the scalpel in his hands tighter and was ready to throw himself at the monster. "Look, I'll stop all this," he shouted and ran forward. All the staff members who were transforming into monsters were attacked by Fan Zhu's scalpel, and their transformations were interrupted. They slashed easily like butter, but they all had nothing but darkness inside them and had turned into shadows themselves. The marks of blows and cuts were clearly visible on their bodies, and they fell and dissolved. "Did you get it?" smirked Fan Zhu. "Tell me when you've had enough." Although he was teasing them, he was completely serious in his face as usual. The floor was filled with either blood or just some dark liquid in which these supposed bodies dissolved like paper in water. They floated there for a while, until the illusion shattered like glass, revealing reality. It was all just a very good illusion. Behind this prism of monstrous figures, there were only ordinary employees and Zhao Hao, who were lying on the floor screaming because Fan Zhu had beaten them instead of monsters. Now he was standing in front of an empty corridor, dark and unknown where it led to. It was as if he was in that mental hospital again. "Another illusion. Is that all you can do?" he asked somewhere in space, feeling an unpleasant dark energy around him. Suddenly, particles of misty dark power flew out of that corridor. They turned into a strange creature, a huge eye, in the iris of which there were more eyes. It was as if protected by something like ribs or claws, which covered the eye and supported it. And at the bottom there was a spine. Where the pelvis should be, there were more eyes, and the whole construction stood on a set of human skulls. "How do you see through this illusion?" the eye asked. "You understand people very well, and so they are indistinguishable from reality," Fan Zhu said. "But you're not taking something into account," he continued, remembering how he had touched Fei Fei's skin just a few minutes ago at the entrance. Namely the tactile sensations. All illusions are as smooth as wax, just like the skin of that nurse who was after him earlier. Tactile sensations. "Then why aren't you afraid?" the eye asked, its many pupils watching the boy. "You're only relying on my fear of death, but it's somehow surprising that the dead call me to work," grinned Fan Zhu in response. "It's scary to have to work even when you are already dead." However, he paved and said that just kudos to all the monsters' tricks to scare him. It only ignited a flame in him capable of shattering all their illusions. Fan Zhu walked towards one of the doors. Maybe it was an exit, maybe not. The eye followed him closely and kept up with him, flying beside him, and then went back into the depths of the corridor, slowly disappearing. "Fearless, I remembered you," said the mysterious eye one last time. And Fan Zhu was twirling the scalpel in his hands. After all, he was the one who had rid them of the nurse. If Fan Zhu hadn't gotten anything wrong, the nurse and the hospital as a whole were parts of the same illusion, but also one of the weakest. Fan Zhu looked back at Zhao Hao, who was undergoing a strange transformation. His eyes were bulging, dark liquid was pouring out of them. Sweat was running down his hands and face, veins were protruding, and he was holding his throat as if there was something preventing him from speaking or breathing. Even if monsters could transform people, there was a certain range to it. He reached out his hand towards Zhao Hao's face. Fan Zhu remembered his tearful and desperate face as he shouted that he would go with him no matter what. The guy with glasses fell to the floor, grabbing his throat, and Fan Zhu stood beside him, with a scalpel in his hands. He slit his throat to start again. An exit icon in the distance showed up. Once again, it was him, Zhao Hao, and a few staff members trying to leave this place. Although this illusion is controllable, the best way to fight it is to stay awake. "Let's go," Fan Zhu commanded and opened the doors. They eventually came out on the road to the academy. It was already a deep but clear night outside. The illusion was gone. One more time, Fan Zhu slit his throat again. It looked like they would inevitably have to go to the illusionary world, so Zhao Hao must overcome his fear. The panicked people around him didn't create a favorable atmosphere when he tried to explain to them what was involved. He told them that this place would cause all sorts of illusions and could even make them think that they had left this world. But it was all untrue. Suddenly he put a hand on the guy with the glasses on his shoulder and told him that he realized he was the only one who could save them all, and then decided to motivate him by promising him that he could grope Fei Fei when they all got out of here, getting in who no one else could. Zhao Hao immediately blushed and was taken aback. "Don't push me like that," he said stammeringly. After that, there were a few more of the same fantasies, which Fan Zhu managed to quickly dispel. However, all the staff members were still unable to overcome their fear of these illusions. They were all lying on the floor, unable to wake up from the nightmare, squirming and moaning, grabbing their necks as if something was preventing them from breathing. After checking some things, Fan Zhu realized that everything here was an illusion. And everyone's illusion is different. Zhao Hao was also lying and squirming on the floor. Fan Zhu was squatting beside him. In other words, everyone's nightmare should only be destroyed by themselves. He shook Zhao Hao's shoulders and asked him to wake up, but he only mumbled something and didn't open his eyes. He was deep in his nightmare. Fan Zhu gave him a good slap, and then another and another and another. In the end, he even kicked him in the groin. But apart from the fact that the guy with glasses was now beaten up and in addition to the illusion nightmare, he was also in physical pain, nothing else happened. It didn't work at all. Fan Zhu scratched his head thoughtfully. Then he took out a scalpel. How about we try it like this? He grasped the knife in his hand tightly, swung and plunged the blade into Zhao Hao's leg. The guy with glasses immediately cried out, "No, don't." After a moment, his eyes opened and rolled back. Zhao Hao died either from fright or from the blows. Fan Zhu was taken aback. Then he became very worried, because he had no idea how to save his friend, or if there was any way to save him. Awakening him from his illusion was more difficult than he had imagined, and he had failed time after time. He had one last option left, but he would have to die again. He put the scalpel to his throat. If he failed this time, then he would have to give up. Fan Zhu once again slit his neck. Time rewinds again. Zhao Hao walked next to Fan Zhu in good health and told him about his dream. The guy with glasses dreamed that he was touching the soft belly of a girl, and her clothes were as soft as a feather to his touch. He was almost glowing with happiness, and Fan Zhu didn't know where to get away from him, so he just listened and walked forward. Zhao Hao continued and annoyedly said that he was about to do something indecent with this girl in his dream when he suddenly woke up. "What bad luck," sighed the guy with glasses as they walked down one of the long corridors. Suddenly, one of the guys noticed a sign that said exit and pointed his finger at it. Fan Zhu immediately went towards the door, and Zhao Hao happily and excitedly ran and sprinting after him, reasoning that he would find someone's real body to investigate once they got out of here. But suddenly, Fan Zhu realized something. Zhao Hao is quite timid and cowardly, but his main trait is his, shall we say, peculiarity. Well, or concern. He was clearly not shy in expressing his thoughts or fantasy to any taste. Though fear could not be overcome, it could be avoided with strong feelings. What could be stronger than the excitement of a lonely adult guy whose only fantasy is the possibility of touching some girl? Fan Zhu told Zhao Hao to turn up the volume on his phone. He asked why, and the guy replied that they were about to watch Zhao Hao's favorite movie. Immediately, an illusion appeared in Zhao Hao's mind, not as scary as usual, but rather pleasant for him, which was what Fan Zhu wanted. The environment turned into a school classroom, and a young teacher with long blonde hair walked in, holding a long ruler. Stayed with the most beautiful teacher after class. The woman herself was quite frankly dressed, which gave away the direction of Zhao Hao's favorite movie, which served as the basis for his hallucinations. The guy with glasses instantly blushed and was dumbfounded, not knowing what to do. The woman flirtatiously put her finger to her lip and said that Zhao Hao had made a mistake for which he should be punished. The guy with glasses was embarrassed and resented the way Fan Zhu had exploited the possibility of illusions. "Is this the kind of joke you're making? Do you want to know the difference between normal and deadly jokes?" the embarrassed Zhao Hao asked. After that, he lowered his eyes to the floor, although of course he would be completely bewitched by such illusions. After all, this was what he wanted most. Fan Zhu didn't see anything funny about it and replied that he wasn't joking, but saving his life. The guy with glasses returned to his phone to continue watching. He opened the video on the website. A woman's lips appeared on the screen, which hinted at the content. A woman with blonde hair in the guise of a teacher, with her shirt unbuttoned and a ruler in her hands, was saying into the camera that she would punish the viewer. Zhao Hao was very embarrassed that he wasn't watching this alone, and Fan Zhu only asked that is this the type of video that brings him pleasure. In any case, once you get to that point in the dream, just close your eyes and do nothing. Fan Zhu dictated instructions to him. Zhao Hao nodded, and he was riddled with joy that in such a situation, they were distracted to watch something that could distract him. The guy in the back asked what the two were watching, and the girl next to him mused meaningfully. The woman in the video continued to pretend to punish the viewer, which was accompanied by the characteristic spanking, and everyone stood awkwardly in silence listening to it. Indecent noises and more spankings were heard from the phone speakers. The more it got, the redder the guy with the glasses was. He was no longer embarrassed by the presence of other people anymore and was satisfied with what was happening on the screen. From the tension and excitement, his brain felt like it was exploding and he was drenched in sweat. In his fantasy, this woman dressed as a teacher was already sitting on his lap, as if she had been waiting for this all her life, and he was proud and pleased with himself, but he was almost steaming out of his ears. Fan Zhu looked at his friend's violent reaction and said that they should probably go now. He reminded the guy with glasses not to forget that feeling of satisfaction when they were in danger again, as it was the only way to shatter his illusion. He nodded to the others, and they slowly wandered further down the corridor while Zhao Hao almost flew on the wings of love behind him. Fan Zhu thought that he was constantly having such boring dreams time after time. He was even starting to miss his monster wife. He already wanted to finally go home. After a while, he found the guy and the girl dead. Their faces were bloody. Fan Zhu only concluded that they had failed, though it wasn't that he was trying so hard to save them. He only hoped that his horny friend would manage. Fan Zhu looked at him, and he was dumbfounded by the scene he saw. Zhao Hao was tearing his clothes and saying all sorts of vulgar gibberish to himself. In his fantasy, he was apparently licking something or someone, so he was shaking his head from side to side with his tongue sticking out. Fan Zhu pressed his hand to his forehead, not even knowing what he was feeling looking at this. It looked like Zhao Hao had really decided to have various degrees of perverted games with this woman in his fantasy. But suddenly, an unfamiliar energy caught his attention. Although the guy with glasses was completely immersed in his illusions and was moving his hips back and forth in the air, a yellow energy different from Fan Zhu's blue energy was appearing around his body. These streams of power. He will awaken soon. Fan Zhu concluded in surprise. In the end, Zhao Hao fell down and lay contentedly on the ground, red as a cancer and drooling. But suddenly he woke up and shouted, "Fei Fei." The guy with glasses jumped up like a snap. He got to his feet and asked her not to run away, still not realizing that reality was in front of him and the illusion had dissipated. But lo and behold, he noticed Fan Zhu beside him, and asked him if he had dealt with the illusion, if they had found a way out in the end. The guy was silent and looked at him seriously, without a fraction of a joke or mockery. "Are you really Fan Zhu?" asked Zhao Hao, coming closer but at a safe distance. "Let me check," he shouted, extending his arm. Fan Zhu sighed and pulled his hand away from him. "Have you lost your head?" "We'll fix it now," he said a little mockingly, but still didn't smile. He started listing all of his favorite genres and Zhao Hao's erotic videos that he had peeked at while he was in a long struggle with the illusion. The guy with glasses immediately ran forward to him, asking him to be quiet and give him back his phone. But Fan Zhu stepped aside and so Zhao Hao awkwardly fell to the floor, right on top of the corpses of the other two people who were with them but lost the war against illusions. Zhao Hao raised his head, recovering from the impact. The guy with glasses fell on his back and backed up, but Fan Zhu just shrugged his shoulders. It couldn't be helped. "Let's go," the guy said to his friend and put his hand towards the big door, which should be the only exit to the real world from the illusions. The door was very heavy, but it was open and creaked open. The two of them were greeted by a blindingly bright light, so bright that they couldn't figure out exactly how they got out. They ended up in the middle of the park and Zhao Hao looked around panically, wondering if it was another illusion. But there was no catch and he told Fan Zhu that it seemed they had gotten out after all. Yes, indeed, Fan Zhu confirmed his words as he looked up. There were countless demons and monsters of various shapes and sizes crawling across the sky, and the sky was not bright red, but a horrible dark yellow color with dark clouds. Just then, Fan Zhu asked Zhao Hao if he happened to have awakened as in a spur. Awakening. The guy with glasses stared at him in surprise, but then he remembered something and replied that at some point he had felt an incredible surge of strength, as well as a heightening of all his senses. "What did you think your ability was?" Fan Zhu asked. "Ability?" The guy with glasses thought for a moment, but then he said that he didn't know. And besides, one Jai Teng said that not every awakened person could use any ability. He looked upset. Maybe he wanted to be as cool and strong as his friend. But then Zhao Hao asked what ability Fan Zhu had. He was silent at first and didn't know how to answer correctly. "My ability is to predict the future," he said, of course lying a bit. "But on the other hand, you can really predict the future if you have already been there and just went back." Zhao Hao was of course astonished. "What? The future? So that's why you knew where we had to go and where danger awaited us?" The guy with glasses marveled. Fan Zhu wondered. If there really was an organization of Aspers in the world, he would be able to rise up there very quickly due to his ability to know the future. He looked up, where something like a huge centipede was floating in the sky, and thought about all the monsters he had to deal with. Then he'd have to get even stronger, and then get revenge on those creatures for everything. But of course especially his wife, whose revenge was his current reason to live and whom he had been dreaming about ever since he woke up in this world. He tried to understand the structure of this world, how illusions work. If the hospital was inside the office, or rather in the same place, just in a different reality, then why couldn't he see it now? Had the two merged together, bringing the real world forward? There was some sort of white mist creeping around the building. It turns out that if they ran into some kind of monster, it wouldn't be able to attack them. But if it happened that the door was blocked, then even with Fan Zhu's ability to roll back in time, they wouldn't be able to get out of here. The fog led them to the entrance of the building and Fan Zhu opened the door but did not go inside. He looked back at Zhao Hao. If things went badly, 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 returns wouldn't be enough to make things right. The guy with glasses didn't really understand what was required of him, but he seemed to be willing to follow Fan Zhu anywhere. What did he have to lose? But the guy was worried about something else. Why, even with his awakened Esper abilities, Zhao Hao couldn't see this strange world. He decided to ask and clarify if the guy with glasses noticed anything strange around him. He immediately began to look around in panic. But to him the sky was clear, a beautiful full moon illuminating the streets. What kind of weirdness is this? Fan Zhu, are you alright? Asked Zhao Hao, looking up and trying to see something there. A large black crow flew above them. Oh, you mean that bird, said Fan Zhu, but something else caught his eye. A huge monster with a human face, fangs and horns was looming over Zhao Hao's head, and he looked around, but saw nothing supernatural. Even though he had awakened, he still couldn't see anything. Maybe his strength is still too weak, Fan Zhu suggested. Or maybe not everyone with supernatural powers can see this other world. Fan Zhu stood up and thought with his hand on his chin. And Zhao Hao at this moment was torn with frustration and his helplessness. He thought that it was a pity that he didn't have the abilities that Fan Zhu had. How enviable. It would be so sad if he accidentally ran into any trouble. Oh, how can I think like that? Enough. He reproached himself in thought. And then he suggested to his friend that he should leave this place, because it was getting creepy. They immediately headed forward. But Fan Zhu decided to start a dialogue and asked how Zhao Hao managed to get out of his illusion. Well, how did it work? You taught me one way. You know, penetrating illusions. Zhao Hao thought, remembering what had happened in his mind. Fan Zhu thought it was all suspicious. He was the only one who could get out, but he had to kill himself to regain the ability to see all those weird things. But when we wanted to see them, it didn't work. It's probably because of Zhao Hao. In the dream, you were doing something very dirty, right? Fan Zhu clarified. I was doing what? The guy with glasses immediately cried out and covered himself in a thick blush. Fan Zhu immediately reminded him of how he was moving strangely, moaning and twitching, and also. But before he could finish, the guy with glasses shouted for him not to continue listing this shame. I was only making an assumption, Fan Zhu defended himself. Maybe you did something wrong and woke up because of it. The guy decided to still ask until the end. Zhao Hao agreed to say only on the condition that Fan Zhu would not tell anyone, and he promised him that he would not say anything. The guy with glasses first said that there was nothing special there at all. As soon as he opened his eyes, he found himself alone with the teacher. He was sitting on a chair and she was standing behind him with her arms around his neck. The woman was breathing in his ear, seducing him like a demoness. Zhao Hao clutched his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly, she began to reveal her monstrous essence and said that Zhao Hao should go with him and kill someone. A dark, unpleasant aura thickened in the room. The guy with glasses said that he first started to hear horrible and unpleasant sounds. And then, she began to run her icy hands along his body.